What if the story of human creation didn't begin in the book of Genesis, but thousands of years earlier in ancient Sumer? Long before the Bible was written, clay tablets told of powerful beings known as the Anunnaki, entities said to have descended from the heavens and transformed life on Earth. Some believe they were worshipped as gods. Others claim they were visitors from another world who engineered humanity for their own mysterious purpose. But what do the ancient texts actually say? And why does this theory continue to fascinate millions around the world? In this video, we explore the mystery of Anunnaki Genesis and the controversial claim that the alien gods created humanity. In the summer of 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was digging through a mound of sun-baked earth in northern Iraq when his workers uncovered something that would eventually rewrite the story humanity tells about itself. Beneath the dust of what had once been the Assyrian city of Nineveh lay a buried library, over 30,000 clay tablets, pressed with a wedge-shaped script no living person could read. It would take decades for scholars to unlock that script. And when they finally did, they discovered they were not looking at the myths of a primitive desert people. They were looking at a history that described, in exact and repeated detail, a group of beings the ancient Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Translated roughly, the word means those who from heaven to earth came. Not gods in the abstract poetic sense we are used to from later religions, but physical beings who ate, who argued, who built, who ruled, and who, according to these same tablets, made human beings on purpose, for a reason, and for a job. This is the oldest civilization we know of, Sumer. It appears in the historical record with no clear predecessor, already possessing writing, irrigation, mathematics based on the number 60, astronomy accurate enough to track 5 planets invisible to the naked eye, and a body of law. Conventional history calls this the beginning of civilization. It offers no real explanation for why it happened so quickly, or why it happened, seemingly, all at once, around 3800 BCE, in a stretch of marshland between 2 rivers. The Sumerians themselves offered an explanation. They said their civilization was a gift. They said it was brought to them, deliberately, by beings who came from the sky, who taught them to farm, to build, to write, to count the stars, and who ruled over them as kings rule over a kingdom they engineered. This is the story the Sumerians left behind on hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, a story that later became the raw material for the book of Genesis, for the flood of Noah, for the Garden of Eden, and for the God who breathes life into clay and calls it man. Modern scholars, for the most part, read these tablets as literature, beautiful, historically important literature, but literature all the same, in the same category as the myths of Zeus or the legends of Ra. This series takes a different position, one first popularized in the 20th century by researchers who noticed something the mythological reading struggles to explain away: the astonishing, mechanical precision of the details. Sumerian texts describe Nibiru, a planet on a long, elliptical orbit that swings through the outer solar system only once every few thousand years. They describe the Anunnaki arriving on this planet, splashing down in the waters of the Persian Gulf, and establishing their first base at a place called Eridu, which in Sumerian literally translates to home built far away. They describe a chain of command, a genetic hierarchy, and a civil war among the Anunnaki themselves that led ultimately to the decision to create a slave species, us. To understand where this story comes from, you have to go back further than Sumer, to the physical evidence sitting quietly in museum basements around the world, most of it never displayed to the public because there has never been an official framework for explaining it. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The Louvre, the Pergamon in Berlin, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad before its looting in 2003, all hold similar troves. Only a small fraction of these tablets have ever been fully translated. Assyriology is a field with perhaps a few hundred qualified specialists worldwide, working through a body of text larger than the surviving literature of Greece and Rome combined. Entire libraries excavated over a century ago remain, to this day, sitting in crates, untranslated, unread since the moment they were sealed into the earth thousands of years before Rome existed. What has been translated is enough to build a coherent, internally consistent narrative, one that does not read like scattered myth so much as like history, filtered through the only vocabulary available to the people writing it down. When a Sumerian scribe describes a being who flies through the sky in a mu, a word literally meaning that which rises straight up, conventional scholarship translates this as a sky chariot, a symbolic vehicle for a sun god. Researchers working from the ancient astronaut framework read it more literally, a rocket. When the tablets describe the Anunnaki wearing garments that let them breathe in hostile conditions and helmets that cover the entire head, conventional scholarship calls this ceremonial religious garb. The alternative reading is a spacesuit. Neither reading can be proven with certainty from the text alone, but taken together, tablet after tablet, image after image, seal after cylinder seal, a pattern begins to form that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The central figure in unlocking this reading for a modern audience was a man named Zecharia Sitchin, a Russian-born, Israeli-educated journalist and scholar who spent decades of his life learning to read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform directly from the original tablets, rather than relying solely on the translations of mainstream academia. Beginning in 1976 with a book called The 12th Planet, Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods in the metaphorical sense at all, but flesh and blood extraterrestrial beings from a planet in our own solar system, a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, which does not currently appear on any astronomer's chart, and whose existence remains one of the most contested claims in the field of ancient astronaut theory. Sitchin's work has been criticized extensively by professional Assyriologists who argue that his translations selectively interpret ambiguous terms to fit a predetermined conclusion. His defenders counter that mainstream Assyriology has its own predetermined conclusion, one that assumes a priori that ancient people were incapable of describing real physical technology, and therefore translates every unfamiliar object as symbolic or religious by default. This series will lay out both the tablets and the arguments, and let you weigh the case for yourself. What is not in dispute is this: the texts exist, they are strange, they are specific, and they are far older than anything else we call history. So let's start where the story starts, according to the tablets themselves. Not on Earth, somewhere else first. The Sumerian creation account, preserved most completely in a text scholars call the Enuma Elish, does not begin with Earth at all. It begins with the birth of the solar system itself, described as a celestial drama involving primordial bodies of water, personified as gods, who give birth to planets one by one in an order that, strikingly, roughly matches the actual physical order of the planets in our solar system as we understand it today. Thousands of years before the invention of the telescope. Into this system, the text describes an intruder, a rogue planet, referred to as Nibiru, or in some translations, Marduk, that entered the solar system on a path different from all the others. Not a neat circular orbit like Earth's, but a long, stretched, comet-like ellipse that would carry it from somewhere beyond Pluto, in toward the sun, and back out again, on a cycle the tablets give as approximately 3,600 years. On its inward pass, according to the account, this rogue planet collided catastrophically with a much larger planet that once existed between the current orbits of Mars and Jupiter, a planet the Sumerians called Tiamat. The collision, the tablets say, split Tiamat into pieces. Half of it struck loose, became the asteroid belt we observe today, a field of rubble where a planet should be. The other half was knocked into a new orbit, wounded but intact, and became the planet Earth. It is worth pausing on this because it is one of the most scientifically startling claims to survive from the ancient world. Modern astrophysics has, entirely independently, arrived at a remarkably similar model for the formation of our own moon, called the giant impact hypothesis, in which a Mars-sized body called Theia is believed to have struck the early Earth, with debris from that collision coalescing into the moon, and the asteroid belt itself remains a genuine puzzle to planetary scientists. Not because a planet is missing there, current models suggest one never fully formed there, but the region's chaotic, fragmented nature is broadly consistent with some kind of violent, disruptive history. The Sumerians had none of the mathematics, none of the telescopes, none of the physics required to construct such a model by guesswork. And yet there it is, carved in clay in the oldest written creation story on Earth. It is on this newly formed planet, wounded, half-destroyed, and richly seeded with water, that the tablets say Nibiru's inhabitants eventually settled. Not immediately. The Sumerian king lists and the associated cosmological texts describe a long gap between the formation of the solar system and the first landing, a gap the tablets measure in hundreds of thousands of years, corresponding intriguingly with the very periods modern archaeology and genetics associate with the emergence and slow development of early hominid species in East Africa. According to the account, the Anunnaki did not come to Earth as explorers or tourists. They came because they needed something. Their own planet, the tablets say, was dying. Nibiru's atmosphere was failing, and the only substance capable of repairing it, at least according to the technology the Anunnaki possessed, was a fine particulate form of gold, capable of being suspended in an upper atmosphere to patch a thinning shield the way. In a much cruder modern analogy, engineers today discuss the use of aerosolized particles to manage a changing climate. And Earth, they discovered, had gold. Enormous quantities of it in South Africa, in the ancient goldfields whose scale still puzzles modern mining historians. Mines in that region, near a site called Mponeng, extend over 2 miles beneath the surface, among the deepest excavations on the planet. Geologists have found evidence of much older mining activity in that same region going back tens of thousands of years earlier than any known civilization existed there to have mined it. Evidence that includes ancient shafts, primitive tools, and adzes found sealed inside rock strata securely dated to be far older than the Bantu and San peoples traditionally credited with South Africa's ancient mining tradition. Conventional archaeology has no confident explanation for who created these earliest shafts or why they were abandoned. The tablets offer one, that this was the very first industrial operation on planet Earth, run not by humans, because humans as we know them did not yet exist, but by the Anunnaki themselves. The first Anunnaki mission to Earth, according to the tablets, was commanded by a figure named Enki, described as a brilliant scientist, an engineer, and crucially for what comes later in this story, the son of the ruler of Nibiru through a lesser-ranked wife. Enki's fleet, the tablets say, splashed down in the Persian Gulf and established the very first settlement, Eridu, the home-built far away, mentioned earlier, on the marshy shores of what would become southern Iraq. This was not a colony intended for permanent human-style habitation. It was a mining and processing operation, an outpost built by beings whose entire purpose was to extract gold, refine it, and ship it home to patch a failing atmosphere on a planet most humans, to this day, have never heard of. For a time, the tablets suggest, this operation ran using automated and semi-automated extraction methods, but the true labor-intensive work of deep mining required something else. It required hands. It required backs. It required workers capable of following instructions, capable of enduring harsh, repetitive physical labor for years at a time, and, from the perspective of the Anunnaki command structure, expendable. The tablets describe a second wave of Anunnaki arriving under a different commander, Enki's half-sister, a figure named Nin-Hursag, whose title translates roughly to Lady of the Mountain, and whose specialty, according to the texts, was not engineering but the life sciences. Between Enki's technical mastery and Nin-Hursag's expertise in what the tablets describe using terms modern translators render, controversially, as terms resembling genetics and reproduction, the stage was set for the event this entire series is built around, the deliberate creation of a new being, engineered specifically to do the work the Anunnaki themselves no longer wanted to do. Before we get to that moment, though, there is a rebellion to cover, because according to the tablets, the miners revolted first. And it was that revolt, not some abstract divine plan, that pushed the Anunnaki toward creating us. The lower-ranked members of the Anunnaki expedition, the tablets say, spent decades toiling in those gold mines. Generation after generation of their own kind worked to exhaustion far from home, watching their commanders live in comfort in the newly built cities while they themselves broke rock underground. Eventually, the tablets describe they had enough. They set down their tools. They surrounded the residence of Enlil, the half-brother of Enki, and, by Nibiruan succession law, the senior commander on Earth, despite Enki having arrived first and having done the technical work of establishing the mission. This detail matters enormously for everything that follows. Enki was the elder son, but born to a concubine. Enlil was the younger son, but born to the official wife, and thus, under Nibiruan primogeniture, the legitimate heir and ultimate authority. This unresolved rivalry between the two half-brothers, one the brilliant, sympathetic scientist, the other the rigid, authoritarian, legal ruler, is the single thread that runs through nearly every major event described in the tablets, all the way through the creation of man, the flood, and beyond, and it will resurface again and again throughout this series. Faced with a full-scale strike by his own exhausted workforce, and unwilling to simply exterminate them, Enlil convened a council with Anu, the supreme ruler of Nibiru, who had traveled to Earth to personally assess the crisis, along with Enki and Ninhursag. It was in this council, according to the Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete Akkadian narrative texts we possess, that the decision was made. Rather than continue forcing Anunnaki laborers to work the mines, they would create an entirely new being, a primitive worker, built specifically for hard labor, who would take over the mining operation permanently, freeing the Anunnaki from the work altogether. The Atrahasis text is explicit and almost clinical in its description of this council's reasoning. It reads, in essence, that a substitute needed to be created to bear the load so that the Anunnaki could be relieved of it forever. It is here, at the edge of this council chamber, with the gods of Sumer arguing over blueprints for a being not yet made, that the next part of this story begins. Because the decision to create us was not an act of love. According to the very tablets that first told our species' origin story, we were not made in tenderness, and we were not made in the image of the divine out of pure creative joy. We were made to solve a labor problem. We were made to dig. And the being who would do the actual engineering, Enki, the scientist, working alongside Ninhursag, the geneticist, was about to attempt something that, according to the tablets, had never been done successfully before. The blending of two separate genetic lines, Anunnaki and an existing Earth primate, into a single new species, capable of following instructions, capable of reproducing itself, and capable, above all, of work. That story, the actual creation, the failed attempts, the successful model, and the being the tablets name as the first true modern human. The mixing of the clay, the Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian on tablets dated to roughly 1700 BCE, but clearly copying source material far older, describes the creation of the first worker not as a single miraculous act, but as a laboratory process, attempted, failed, revised, and attempted again. Enki, tasked with the technical execution, is described summoning Ninhursag to assist because his own expertise lay in engineering and metallurgy, not in the biology of reproduction. The text has Enki saying, in essence, that the birth goddess is present and that she should create the mold. This is not the language of poetic metaphor. It is the language of a project brief, one god handing a technical problem to the specialist qualified to solve it. The method the tablets describe is worth laying out plainly because it has become the single most contested passage in all of ancient astronaut literature. Ninhursag, the text says, takes clay, mixes it with the blood of a slain Anunnaki, and combines this mixture inside her own body, gestating the result until a new being is born. Mainstream Assyriology reads clay here as purely symbolic, the same way Genesis later describes God forming Adam from the dust of the ground, an artistic way of expressing mortality and earthly origin. Ancient astronaut researchers read the passage differently, and their reading rests on a linguistic detail. The word used in these tablets, rendered into English as clay, is closer in its root meaning to that which is essence, or that which binds, and appears in related contexts describing the combining of two substances into a single new one. Under this reading, clay is not mud. It is genetic material taken from an existing terrestrial hominid, an early form of Homo erectus already walking the plains of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years by this point. And the blood of a god is not a ritual sacrifice, but a literal biological contribution, an act of combining Anunnaki genetic material with that of an existing Earth species to produce something new. Under this reading, the being that resulted was not created from nothing. It was upgraded from something that already existed. This detail matters because it resolves a question conventional mythology never adequately answers. Why would a god need clay at all, if a god can simply speak a being into existence? The Sumerian gods, notably, never do that. They never simply will a human into being the way later, more abstract monotheistic texts describe. Every single Sumerian and Akkadian creation account describes a physical, hands-on process involving existing biological material, laboratory vessels, birthing pools, and repeated attempts. This is not the language of omnipotent creation. It is the language of applied science working within real constraints, and it is a detail almost too subtle and too consistent across independent tablets to have been invented purely for narrative flourish by scribes with no scientific framework of their own to draw on. According to the Atrahasis text and a closely related, even more detailed account preserved on tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, the process did not succeed on the first attempt. Ninhursag is described creating a series of beings, 14 at a time, 7 placed in birthing wombs on one side of a chamber, and 7 on the other, a process the tablets associate with 14 birth goddesses, lesser Anunnaki, assigned to carry the experimental fetuses to term. Several of these early attempts, the tablets say, produced beings with serious defects, some without the ability to reproduce, some physically deformed, some mentally incapable of the basic tasks required of them. A separate and remarkable text, sometimes called the myth of Enki and Ninmah, describes Ninhursag deliberately creating a series of flawed beings in a kind of drinking contest with Enki, daring him to find each one a role in society regardless of its defect, a tale scholars have long read as an origin myth for human disability and difference, but which, under the ancient astronaut framework, reads more plainly as a description of genuine failed trials in an active genetic engineering program, with each defective outcome carefully catalogued rather than discarded. Eventually, the tablets describe a successful model, a being with the correct proportion of Anunnaki genetic material to Earth primate genetic material, capable of understanding and following instructions, capable of physical labor at a level far exceeding any existing terrestrial primate, and, crucially, capable of reproducing on its own, meaning the Anunnaki would never again need to run this laborious creation process for every single new worker. This being is named, across multiple traditions and multiple names for the same concept, Lulu, or Lulu Amelu, meaning roughly the primitive worker, or in a related and even more direct rendering, the mixed one. The tablets are unambiguous that this creature's entire purpose, at the moment of its creation, was labor. Nothing more. It was built to bear the yoke that the Anunnaki miners had refused to bear any longer, and the tablets describing this moment record something close to celebration among the Anunnaki Council. The strike was over, the mines could be restaffed, and an entire species of disposable, self-replicating labor had just been brought into existence to make sure no Anunnaki would ever again need to lift a shovel. If this account is even partially accurate, it forces an uncomfortable recalibration of everything we assume about human origins, because it means the species did not emerge from a slow, undirected process of natural evolution alone, the standard scientific account, but was deliberately intervened upon, accelerated, and engineered at a specific genetic bottleneck for a specific practical purpose by an outside intelligence already possessing spaceflight, genetic manipulation, and a working understanding of hominid biology thousands of years, potentially far more. before conventional archaeology places the emergence of anatomically modern humans. It is worth noting here, carefully and honestly, that this does not require discarding evolutionary biology altogether. Even the ancient astronaut framework, as laid out across its most serious proponents, generally accepts that a pre-existing hominid line, Homo erectus, already the product of a long evolutionary process on Earth, provided the biological base material. What the tablets claim is not that evolution is false, but that at a critical juncture, an outside intelligence intervened in that process directly, splicing in additional genetic material to produce a leap in cognitive and physical capability that mainstream paleoanthropology still, to this day, cannot fully explain through gradual natural selection alone. This is not, incidentally, a fringe observation confined to ancient astronaut circles. Mainstream evolutionary biology has long grappled with what is sometimes informally called the Great Leap Forward, a period beginning roughly 50,000 years ago, in which the archaeological record shows an abrupt and startling acceleration in human behavioral complexity, symbolic art, sophisticated tool composition, structured burial, long-distance trade networks, all appearing in a geological eye blink compared to the hundreds of thousands of years of relative behavioral stasis that preceded it, despite the physical brain structure of Homo sapiens having existed largely unchanged for far longer than that. Respected evolutionary biologists, including figures such as Richard Leakey, have publicly noted that the pace and suddenness of this transformation remains genuinely difficult to account for using standard models of gradual selective pressure alone. Conventional science generally attributes this leap to a mutation enabling complex language or to a threshold effect in existing brain architecture, an explanation grounded firmly in natural, undirected processes and one most working scientists find sufficient. The ancient astronaut framework proposes a different, far more direct catalyst for the same observed pattern. A second, later intervention by the Anunnaki, refining an earlier and cruder worker model into something closer to the fully modern human being alive today. A claim this series will return to directly in a later part when we cover the tablet's account of a being named Adapa and a garden the Sumerians called Aden. The successful creation of Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker, is described in the tablets as having taken place at Enki's cult center, the city of Eridu, using what the texts repeatedly refer to as an egg house, a term Sitchin and later researchers have translated as a birthing laboratory, a physical structure equipped for the gestation process. Some tablets go further, describing the involvement of what is rendered as a purification pool, and instruments used in the process that scholars have struggled to identify with any known Sumerian ritual object, a detail ancient astronaut researchers point to as further evidence of genuine technical apparatus being described in a vocabulary the scribes had no better words for. Whatever the precise nature of the process, the outcome, according to every version of the text, was the same. A being who could work the mines, a being who was, in the blunt language of one surviving fragment, the image of the gods, but not their equal, a servant species built in a recognizable form because that was the most efficient template already sitting right there in the African savanna, requiring only modification rather than invention from scratch. It is at this point worth addressing directly one of the most electrifying pieces of physical evidence sometimes cited alongside the tablet accounts, because unlike the cuneiform texts, this piece of evidence sits not in a museum archive, but in the human genome itself. Modern genetic science has firmly established that all anatomically modern humans alive today descend from a remarkably small ancestral population, a finding often described as a genetic bottleneck, dated by most researchers to somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago. Mainstream science generally attributes this bottleneck to environmental catastrophe, climate stress, or disease, reducing an already small early human population even further. Ancient astronaut proponents point instead to the tablets, which describe precisely this kind of narrow, deliberately engineered founder population, a handful of successfully created hybrid beings from whom the entire later human race is said to descend. Both explanations, it should be said plainly, remain compatible with the same underlying genetic data. The bottleneck itself is scientific consensus, its cause is not. What the ancient astronaut framework adds is not new genetic evidence, but an old written account that appears, on its face, to have been describing a bottleneck event millennia before geneticists identified one exists at all. There is a second piece of contested evidence worth raising here as well, because it recurs constantly throughout later parts of this series: the peculiar structure of human DNA itself. Roughly 98% of the human genome consists of sequences that do not code for any known protein, long dismissed by earlier generations of geneticists under the label junk DNA, a term that has fallen increasingly out of favor as research has revealed that much of this non-coding material serves regulatory functions we are only beginning to understand. Ancient astronaut researchers, most prominently Sitchin himself, seized on the earlier junk DNA terminology to argue something more provocative: that this non-coding material represents inactive, artificially suppressed genetic sequences, essentially a locked or dormant portion of the human genetic code, deliberately switched off by whoever engineered the species, limiting our natural lifespan, our cognitive capacity, or both, compared to the beings who created us. This claim goes considerably further than what current mainstream genetics supports, and it is presented here as part of the theory under discussion, not as an established scientific finding. The majority of genetic function attributed to non-coding DNA involves regulation, structural scaffolding, and evolutionary remnants such as retroviral insertions, not evidence of deliberate external tampering. Still, the metaphor has proven durable, in part because it maps so cleanly onto a detail the tablets themselves insist on, again and again, across multiple independent texts, that the beings who made us were, from the very beginning, deeply and specifically concerned with limiting what we were capable of. That concern, the tablets tell us, would soon become the central conflict of the entire Anunnaki-human relationship, playing out in a walled garden east of Eridu, around a being with a name every reader of this series will already recognize, and around a piece of forbidden knowledge that, according to the tablets, had far less to do with fruit and far more to do with genetics than 3,000 years of religious tradition ever let on. The garden and the forbidden knowledge. Every child raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition knows some version of the story: a garden, a man, a woman, a tree, a serpent, and a piece of fruit that changes everything. The book of Genesis presents this as the opening act of human moral history, the fall from grace, the origin of sin and shame and mortality. But Genesis, scholars have long acknowledged, was not written in a vacuum. It was compiled by Hebrew scribes during and after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, drawing directly on a much older Mesopotamian literary tradition that had already been circulating for well over 2,000 years by that point. When you set the Genesis account side by side with its Sumerian and Akkadian source material, the differences are as revealing as the similarities, and according to ancient astronaut researchers, those differences are exactly where the real story survives, stripped of the theological polish later editors applied to make an uncomfortable account of genetic engineering, read instead like a simple morality tale about obedience and sin. The garden itself is not a Hebrew invention. The Sumerians describe a real named place, Eden, a word that literally means plain or flatland, referring to the fertile lowland region of southern Mesopotamia where Enki's city of Eridu was built, the same region where the first Anunnaki settlement and mining operations were established. This was not a mythical paradise floating outside of geography. It was an actual walled compound, described in the tablets as a restricted zone, off-limits to the general population of primitive workers, who had by this point spread out across the surrounding territory, laboring in the fields and mines. Within this restricted compound, the tablets describe ongoing genetic research continuing well after the initial creation of Lulu Amelu, research conducted specifically by Enki and his laboratory staff aimed at refining the worker model into something more capable, more intelligent, and more useful. The being at the center of this next phase of the story is named, across several tablets, Adapa, a figure many researchers, including Sitchin, identify as the tablet-based origin of the biblical Adam. Adapa is described not as the first human being in a general sense, since Lululemelu workers already existed in large numbers by this point, but as a specific elevated individual created by Enki through a more advanced version of the same genetic process, resulting in a being with markedly superior intelligence and awareness compared to the mass-produced worker population. Enki, the tablets say, took a special interest in Adapa, teaching him directly, granting him wisdom that exceeded that of ordinary primitive workers, a term the tablets use repeatedly and pointedly in a way that closely parallels the biblical language describing the serpent's promise to Eve that eating from the tree of knowledge would make her wise. This detail alone should give any careful reader pause, because the serpent in the Genesis account has traditionally been read by later Christian tradition as a symbol of evil, of Satan in disguise, tempting humanity into sin. But nothing in the original Hebrew text itself actually identifies the serpent as Satan. That association was added centuries later by early Christian theologians reading their own cosmology backward into an older text. In the original account, the serpent is simply described as more cunning than any other creature, and its role in the narrative is not to destroy humanity, but to give humanity something Yahweh, in that account, was actively withholding: knowledge. And crucially, when read against the Mesopotamian source material, the serpent carries an even more direct connection, because the serpent, or more precisely, the entwined serpent symbol, was one of the primary emblems associated with Enki himself throughout Sumerian iconography, appearing on cylinder seals, temple carvings, and boundary stones for thousands of years, frequently depicted as two snakes coiled around a central staff, a symbol so enduring in its association with healing, medicine, and biological knowledge that it survives to this day as the caduceus, still used as a medical emblem across the modern world, thousands of years after the civilization that first carved it into stone had vanished from history. If the serpent of Genesis is, as this comparative reading suggests, a garbled folk memory of Enki, the scientist god associated with genetic knowledge, then the entire moral structure of the story flips. The being offering forbidden knowledge to humanity is not a villain tempting us into sin. He is the same figure who fought, according to multiple independent tablets, for the creation and improvement of the human species from the very beginning, sympathetic to the workers, in a way his half-brother Enlil consistently was not. And the being forbidding that knowledge, the God who tells Adam and Eve that eating from the tree will bring death, is not, in this reading, God in the absolute singular, omnipotent sense later monotheism would insist on, but Enlil, the rigid, legalistic commander who, according to the earlier tablets covered in Part 1, never wanted to create an intelligent human species in the first place, who only agreed to the creation of a primitive worker to solve an immediate labor crisis, and who is described across dozens of separate tablets voicing anger and alarm whenever humanity's intelligence, numbers, or independence increases beyond what he considers safe. The forbidden tree itself carries a name in the Genesis text worth examining closely: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of moral knowledge in some abstract philosophical sense, ancient astronaut researchers argue, but a phrase that in its original Hebrew and its Mesopotamian antecedents carries a more specific, almost clinical meaning, closer to the knowledge of how to make things, or the knowledge of procreation, a euphemism appearing elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in exactly this reproductive sense. Under this reading, what Adapa, or Adam, gains from the forbidden tree is not abstract moral awareness, but the specific biological knowledge required for the primitive worker species to reproduce independently without requiring Ninhursag's birthing laboratories, a capability the tablet suggests the earliest, most controlled worker models did not originally possess, having instead been produced individually in a controlled facility, generation after generation. Precisely so, their numbers and abilities could remain tightly managed. This reading gains significant support from a detail present in nearly every version of the Mesopotamian account and largely stripped from the final Genesis text. The deep, specific anxiety the ruling Anunnaki express, not about disobedience in the abstract, but about a very particular fear that humanity might next reach for the tree of life itself, gaining not merely the ability to reproduce, but the extended lifespan the Anunnaki themselves possessed. The tablets describe Anunnaki lifespans in staggering figures, individuals living for what the texts render as tens of thousands of years, a detail directly echoed, though dramatically compressed, in the extraordinarily long lifespans attributed to the patriarchs in the early chapters of Genesis itself, Methuselah's 969 years being only the most famous example, figures that have puzzled biblical scholars for centuries, and that aligns suspiciously well, proportionally, with a base 60 Sumerian numbering system in which such figures may originally have represented a different, more modest unit of time before later scribal transmission and translation distorted them. The book of Genesis makes the ruling God's fear explicit in a passage rarely emphasized in Sunday sermons but startling in its plainness once you notice it. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, the text has God saying, and this is quoted directly because the wording matters immensely, "The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." The phrase "one of us" appears here exactly as it does in the earlier Genesis creation account. Let us make man in our image, a plural construction that has troubled monotheistic theologians for millennia, requiring elaborate later doctrinal explanations such as the Christian Trinity to reconcile a single, singular God, apparently speaking of himself in the plural. Read instead against its Mesopotamian source material, where a council of Anunnaki, not a solitary deity, makes every major decision throughout the entire narrative, the plural language stops being a theological puzzle and becomes simply an accurate description, a ruling council, deliberating, genuinely alarmed that their engineered worker species has just closed part of the biological gap between creator and creation, and moving swiftly to make sure that gap does not close any further. The consequence described in Genesis, expulsion from the garden and a life of hard labor outside its walls, tilling soil that would no longer yield freely, maps with uncomfortable precision onto the practical situation the tablets describe. Primitive workers, having gained the ability to reproduce independently, no longer needed to remain confined within Enki's controlled research compound, and were instead released or driven out into the broader agricultural and mining regions of Mesopotamia to labor and multiply on their own, outside the direct daily oversight of their creators. What later religious tradition remembers as a punishment for sin, this reading suggests, was in practical terms simply the moment humanity was let loose from the laboratory, self-sufficient enough to be useful across an entire civilization rather than confined to a single walled facility. It is important to be direct about the limits of this reading because intellectual honesty demands it. The parallels between Genesis and the older Sumerian and Akkadian material are real, extensively documented by mainstream biblical scholars for well over a century, and are not seriously disputed as literary and cultural influences. The flood narrative alone, which this series will cover in detail in a later part, is close enough to its Mesopotamian antecedent, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that few scholars anywhere dispute the direct textual relationship, what remains firmly in the territory of theory, contested even among ancient astronaut researchers themselves, is the specific claim that the forbidden knowledge represents literal genetic engineering rather than a more conventional literary and theological device used by ancient storytellers to explain universal human experiences. Mortality, the pain of childbirth, the burden of agricultural labor, and the uncomfortable self-awareness that separates human consciousness from that of every other animal on Earth. Mainstream biblical scholarship reads the Eden narrative primarily as an etiological myth, a story designed to explain why the world is the way it is, using symbolic rather than literal language, and that remains the dominant academic position today. What is much harder to dismiss, whichever interpretation you find more persuasive, is the sheer specificity of the parallel structure running through both accounts. A restricted garden with a name meaning simply plain, a wise serpent whose symbol became the enduring emblem of medicine and biological knowledge, a ruling authority explicitly described in the plural, an explicit and immediate fear of humanity extending its own lifespan, and a punishment that removes humanity from a controlled environment into a harsher, self-sufficient existence outside its walls. Whether you read this as the fossil record of a real genetic intervention filtered and softened across 3,000 years of religious editing, or as an extraordinary coincidence of independent mythological development around shared human anxieties, the text itself does not change. Only the framework you bring to reading it does. What changed next, according to the tablets, was not confined to a single garden or a single family. Humanity, however it had gained the ability, was now reproducing on its own, spreading across Mesopotamia, and, crucially, continuing to intermarry, according to a handful of deeply strange fragmentary tablets, with members of the Anunnaki themselves. The offspring of these unions carry a name that would echo, largely unchanged, into the opening chapters of Genesis, where they appear seemingly out of nowhere, described in a single startling verse as giants, as mighty men, as men of renown. The Nephilim and the widening rift, Genesis chapter 6, contains one of the strangest, most abruptly introduced passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, a passage so uncomfortable for later theologians that entire schools of interpretation exist purely to explain it away. The text reads that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took wives for themselves of all that they chose. It goes on to say that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, described as the mighty men of old, men of renown, offspring of unions between these sons of God and human women. And then, almost as if the editors of Genesis themselves were uneasy with what they had just written, the passage moves on immediately to the flood, offering no further explanation of who the Nephilim actually were, why their existence provoked divine anger, or what became of them. This passage has generated more theological debate than almost any other verse in Genesis, precisely because it does not fit comfortably into a monotheistic framework. Who are these sons of God, plural, distinct from God himself, capable of taking human wives and fathering children with them? Later Jewish and Christian tradition offers competing answers. Some read them as fallen angels, a position elaborated at great length in the Book of Enoch, a text considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but excluded from the standard biblical canon precisely because of how explicitly it develops this angel-human hybridization narrative. Others, uncomfortable with the idea of angels fathering children, read sons of God instead, as the righteous line of Seth intermarrying with the wicked line of Cain, a considerably more conservative reading that avoids supernatural hybridization altogether, but requires ignoring the plain language of the original text. The ancient astronaut framework offers a third reading, and it is, notably, the reading that requires the least interpretive gymnastics because it maps the Genesis passage directly onto material the Sumerians and Akkadians had already been writing for 2,000 years before Genesis was compiled. The sons of God are the Anunnaki themselves, referred to throughout the earlier Mesopotamian tablets using titles that later Hebrew scribes rendered, imperfectly, as God or the gods, a translation problem this series will return to directly. And the Nephilim are simply the recorded, matter-of-fact product of interbreeding between the Anunnaki and the human population they had engineered, a population that, having gained independent reproductive capability as described in Part 3, was now numerous enough and physically similar enough to its creators for such unions to be common rather than exceptional. The word Nephilim itself derives from a Hebrew root, generally understood to mean the fallen ones, though an alternative and linguistically plausible reading, favored by researchers working from the ancient astronaut framework, connects it instead to a root meaning those who came down, which would align it far more directly with Anunnaki itself, those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting the two terms may originally have described overlapping or identical populations. Not fallen angels in a moral sense, but literally those who descended, whether referring to the original Anunnaki settlers or to their part Anunnaki offspring living among the human population. The Book of Enoch, drawing on older traditions no longer preserved in their original form, goes considerably further than Genesis, naming 200 specific Watchers, a rank of Anunnaki assigned to observe and maintain oversight of the human population, who are said to have descended to a mountain, taken human wives, and fathered a race of giants. The text names their leader as Semjaza and lists individual Watchers by name, each credited with teaching humanity a specific and highly consequential piece of forbidden knowledge: metalworking and weapon making, cosmetics and personal adornment, the reading of omens and astrology, medicine and the properties of plants, and the working of precious materials, a body of knowledge the text explicitly frames as advanced technical instruction, transferred directly from a superior species to a developing one, precisely the same kind of transfer described far more matter-of-factly in the earlier Sumerian material, covering Enki's original teaching of agriculture, irrigation, and writing. The Book of Enoch's account of the Nephilim offspring themselves is considerably darker than the brief Genesis mention suggests, describing them not merely as impressive or renowned, but as physically enormous, consuming vast quantities of food, and eventually turning to violence against the human population and against each other as resources ran short, a detail that, whatever its literal accuracy, at minimum reflects an old and consistent tradition that these hybrid beings represented a genuine problem, not merely a curiosity, for the world they inhabited. It is this specific detail, the danger posed by an expanding population of Anunnaki human hybrids possessing enhanced physical capability and access to advanced knowledge their fully human neighbors did not have, that many ancient astronaut researchers point to as the true underlying motivation for what happens next in the tablets, an event mainstream religious tradition remembers as a punishment for generalized human wickedness, but which the Mesopotamian source material frames in far more specific and far less moralistic terms. Before reaching that event, it is worth pausing to lay out, as clearly and fairly as this evidence allows, exactly where the growing rift between Enki and Enlil stood by this point in the narrative, because it is this rift, more than any abstract concept of sin, that the tablets present as the true engine driving the story forward. Enki, the tablets consistently describe, held a position of increasing sympathy toward humanity, teaching, protecting, and repeatedly working to expand human knowledge and capability, seemingly for reasons connected to genuine scientific curiosity, personal fondness for his creation, and possibly, several researchers have argued, a degree of guilt or responsibility, given that it was his direct genetic material, according to the tablet's account of the birthing process described in Part 2, that had been combined with terrestrial primate material to produce the species in the first place, making him, in a sense the text itself never fully spells out, but strongly implies, humanity's literal biological father as much as its creator. Enlil, by contrast, is consistently described across dozens of independent tablets holding the opposite position, alarmed by human population growth, alarmed by human noise and disruption, a complaint the tablets phrase in terms that read almost comically petty to modern ears, describing Enlil complaining that he could not sleep because of the clamor humanity made, and increasingly alarmed by the specific development covered in this part, the hybridization of the two populations, and the emergence of a physically and intellectually enhanced hybrid class no longer easily distinguishable from or controllable by the Anunnaki ruling structure itself, where Enki appears throughout the tablets as a figure motivated by curiosity, mercy, and an engineer's attachment to his own creation. Enlil appears consistently as a figure motivated by order, hierarchy, and the preservation of a strict separation between creator and created, a separation the growing Nephilim population was actively eroding. This is, it is worth noting plainly, an extraordinarily old story template, one that recurs across an enormous range of human mythological traditions entirely independent of Mesopotamia, and this recurrence deserves to be addressed directly rather than glossed over, because it represents one of the strongest arguments skeptics raise against the entire ancient astronaut framework. Greek mythology describes the Titans and the Olympians locked in conflict over the fate and treatment of humanity, with Prometheus, a Titan, defying the ruling Olympian order to grant humanity fire and knowledge, and suffering eternal punishment for it, a structure remarkably similar to Enki's relationship with Enlil. Hindu tradition describes the Devas and the Asuras, two related but opposed divine factions, locked in ongoing cosmic conflict. Norse mythology describes the Aesir and the Vanir. Egyptian mythology describes protracted conflict between Horus and Set, and separately, the murder and dismemberment of Osiris by his own brother, a civilizing god struck down by a rival within his own divine family. Skeptics of the ancient astronaut framework argue this pattern simply reflects universal features of human social psychology, the tendency of societies everywhere to project their own experience of factional political conflict, sibling rivalry, and generational tension onto their gods, requiring no shared historical event at all to explain the similarity. Ancient astronaut researchers argue the opposite conclusion from the same evidence, that such a consistent structural pattern, recurring across cultures with no known direct contact, sharing not merely a vague theme of divine conflict but the specific and unusual detail of one faction favoring humanity's advancement against the wishes of another, more authoritarian faction, is more plausibly explained as scattered cultural memory of a single, real historical situation, one shared root event refracted differently across separated human populations as they migrated outward from a common Mesopotamian point of origin, rather than as pure independent invention repeating itself by coincidence across 6 or more unrelated mythological systems. This series takes no final position on which explanation is correct and asks that you hold both firmly in mind as we proceed, because the tablets themselves are about to describe an event that appears, with startling consistency, not only in Sumerian and Akkadian sources, but in the flood traditions of over 200 separate cultures worldwide, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from the Hebrew Bible to the mythology of the Hopi and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. A flood, a chosen survivor, a boat, and a decision made at the very highest level of the Anunnaki command structure that humanity, or at least this iteration of humanity, needed to be erased entirely. That decision, the vote that led to it, the individual who broke ranks to prevent total human extinction, and the astonishing technical precision with which the Sumerian tablets describe the mechanics of the flood itself, tying it directly to the orbital return of Nibiru. The flood. The flood story is, without serious dispute among historians of religion, the single most widely distributed narrative in all of world mythology. Versions of it appear in the Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis, in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew account of Noah, in Greek tradition through the story of Deucalion, in Hindu tradition through the story of Manu, in Mesoamerican tradition among the Maya and the Aztec, and in the oral traditions of cultures as geographically separated as the Hopi of the American Southwest and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Comparative mythologists have long debated why a flood narrative in particular achieves this near-universal distribution when other mythological themes do not, and the conventional explanation that flooding is a common enough natural disaster that many separate cultures independently mythologized it remains the dominant academic position. But the Mesopotamian version of the story contains a level of shared, specific narrative detail with its biblical descendant, down to the dimensions of the vessel, the sequence of birds released to test for dry land, and the mountain on which the boat finally comes to rest, that most scholars, regardless of their broader theoretical framework, accept as evidence of direct textual transmission rather than independent invention, meaning that whatever really happened or did not happen, the Hebrew and Mesopotamian accounts are, at minimum, telling the same underlying story. The Sumerian and Akkadian tablets are considerably more specific than Genesis about why the flood happened, and it is in that specificity that the ancient astronaut framework finds its strongest supporting material. where Genesis offers a broad, moralized explanation that God saw the wickedness of man was great upon the earth and that every intention of the human heart was evil continually, the Atrahasis epic offers something far narrower and, frankly, far less flattering to the ruling Anunnaki authority. Enlil, the tablets say, was simply unable to sleep because of the noise humanity made, its numbers having grown enormous, its cities loud, its population no longer manageable by the standards the Anunnaki had originally intended for a controlled labor force. Combined with the deepening alarm over Nephilim hybridization covered in Part 4, the tablets describe Enlil bringing a formal proposal before the full Anunnaki Council, the complete destruction of the human population, to be accomplished not through some slow, deliberate campaign, but through a natural, already scheduled celestial event the Anunnaki possessed the foreknowledge to anticipate, and crucially, the choice either to warn humanity about or to conceal. That celestial event, according to the tablets, was the returning passage of Nibiru itself, completing another circuit of its long, elliptical 3,600-year orbit, swinging back through the inner solar system close enough for its gravitational influence to trigger catastrophic effects on Earth. Massive tidal disruption, a possible pole shift, and, most immediately and violently, the collapse of a great ice shelf the tablets describe sitting over Antarctica, unleashing a wall of water the tablets render, in a phrase surviving almost identically across both the Sumerian and the biblical accounts, as water covering the high hills of the entire inhabited world. This detail is worth sitting with, because it recasts the flood entirely, not as a supernatural punishment summoned into being by an angry deity, but as a known, predictable astronomical and geological event, one the Anunnaki, with their generations of accumulated astronomical observation, would have understood was coming years or even decades in advance, exactly as later Sumerian astronomer priests would understand and predict lunar eclipses centuries before the technology existed anywhere else on Earth to do so. The council vote, according to the Atrahasis text, was not unanimous, and it is this dissent, small, quiet, and ultimately decisive, that the entire remainder of human history hinges on. Enki, the tablets say, argued against the decision, but was overruled by Anu and Enlil, and the council extracted from every member present a binding oath. No Anunnaki was to warn any human being of what was coming. Humanity was to be allowed to perish cleanly in what the ruling faction regarded as a natural correction to an experiment that had grown dangerously beyond its intended scope. Enki, bound by this oath and unwilling to break it outright, is described in the tablets employing a solution that has become, in the retelling of this story, across 3,000 years of religious tradition, one of the most famous loopholes in all of literature. Rather than speaking directly to a human being, which the oath forbade, he spoke instead to the reed wall of a hut, knowing that inside that hut, a man named Ziusudra in the oldest Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian Gilgamesh epic, and Noah in the much later Hebrew account, was listening on the other side. The instructions Enki delivers through this wall, preserved with startling technical consistency across the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hebrew versions of the story, are not vague prophetic warnings, but detailed shipbuilding specifications, precise dimensions, a requirement to seal the vessel with pitch inside and out, a structure divided into multiple decks and internal compartments, and instructions to bring not only Ziusudra's own family, but breeding pairs of animals and stores of seed grain, an unmistakable description of a deliberate genetic preservation effort, an ark, not in the sense of a religious symbol, but in the practical sense of the word, a vessel built specifically to preserve a viable breeding population of both humanity and Earth's animal species through a catastrophic extinction-level event that a technologically advanced observer already knew, with precision, was coming. The Gilgamesh epic even gives the vessel's dimensions as a perfect cube, 60 cubits on each side, an oddly impractical shape for ordinary seafaring, but one modern researchers have noted would have provided exceptional stability against the kind of violent, chaotic wave action a global flood event would produce, favoring survival over navigability. Exactly the design priority you would expect from an engineer building a vessel meant only to float and endure, not to sail anywhere in particular. When the flood came, the tablets describe a catastrophe of almost inconceivable scale, water covering the land for what the different versions render as between 7 and 40 days of active inundation, followed by a much longer period of receding waters, during which Ziusudra releases a sequence of birds. First, a dove, which returns having found no dry land, then a swallow, which also returns, and finally a raven, which does not return, indicating dry ground has finally reappeared, a sequence reproduced almost word for word in the Genesis account of Noah, down to the specific order of the birds released. The vessel, in both the Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, comes to rest on a mountain, Mount Nisir in the Akkadian account, a peak in the Zagros mountain range of what is now western Iran, and Mount Ararat in the biblical account, a peak in eastern Turkey roughly 300 miles to the northwest, a discrepancy scholars generally attribute to the story's long transmission across different cultures with different local geography, rather than evidence against a shared underlying event. What happened next, according to the tablets, is arguably even more revealing than the flood itself, because it describes the reaction of the Anunnaki Council upon discovering that their agreed-upon extinction event had failed. The Atrahasis epic describes Enlil's fury upon learning that a human family had survived, accusing the assembled gods of having broken their sworn oath, a scene of genuine anger and confrontation among beings who, in this account, are not distant, abstract deities issuing judgments from an unreachable heaven, but a functioning, quarreling command structure, discovering that one of their own had defied a direct order. And it is here that the tablets describe something genuinely remarkable. Rather than simply ordering Ziusudra's immediate execution, restoring the intended outcome, the council, and even Enlil himself, according to several versions of the text, relents, and instead of destruction, grants Ziusudra and his wife something closer to reward, described across multiple tablets using language that later translators have rendered as life like a god, an extension of lifespan, and a new, semi-divine or immortal status, a peculiar and abrupt reversal that makes considerably more narrative sense if you read it not as a change of heart in the abstract, but as a practical recognition, forced by circumstance, that with the flood already having accomplished a drastic population reduction on its own, the original justification for total extinction, an unmanageably large human population, had effectively resolved itself, leaving little further reason to hunt down and eliminate the small number of survivors. This is the point in the narrative where the ancient astronaut framework and the mainstream historical and geological record intersect at their most concrete and least speculative, because there is genuine, independently verified physical evidence for a catastrophic flooding event, or series of events, occurring at the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago, a period known to geologists as the Younger Dryas boundary, during which rapid deglaciation triggered sudden, massive sea level rise, submerging vast coastal regions worldwide within a geologically extremely short window of time. Independent core sample and sediment evidence from around the globe supports rapid, catastrophic meltwater events during this period, and researchers working under the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have proposed additional evidence, still actively debated within the scientific community, suggesting the possibility of a fragmenting comet or asteroid impact contributing to abrupt climate destabilization at roughly this same time. None of this mainstream geological evidence requires, or particularly supports, the specific involvement of an extraterrestrial Anunnaki civilization. It stands entirely on its own as an area of ongoing, serious scientific inquiry into abrupt climate change at the end of the Pleistocene. What the ancient astronaut framework adds is not new geological data, but the observation that this same window of time, the end of the last ice age, sits remarkably close to the very period the Sumerian king list itself identifies as the dividing line in its own chronology, the point at which the tablets describe kingship being restored on earth after the flood, lowered again from heaven, and the beginning of the long, slow transition described across the next several parts of this series, from a world directly and openly ruled by the Anunnaki themselves, to a world ruled by human kings, acting as their proxies, their priest representatives, and eventually, their replacements. That transition, the rebuilding of civilization after the flood, the specific cities the tablets say were re-established under direct Anunnaki instruction, and the astonishing and highly specific list of gifts, agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law that the tablets describe humanity receiving in the flood's immediate aftermath, sometimes called by researchers the gifts of civilization, and correlating with the sudden, unexplained appearance of full-formed Sumerian civilization in the archaeological record with no evidence of gradual development. The gifts of civilization. Conventional archaeology presents the emergence of Sumerian civilization as a puzzle it has never fully resolved. Around 3800 BCE, in the space of what is, by archaeological standards, an extremely narrow window of time, the historical record shows the sudden appearance of a fully developed urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia, cities with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental temple architecture, a functioning bureaucratic writing system, standardized units of weight and measure, complex irrigation networks capable of supporting large-scale agriculture in an otherwise marginal floodplain environment, and an astronomical and mathematical tradition sophisticated enough to track the movement of 5 planets and to divide the circle into 360 degrees, a system still in use today. What conventional archaeology does not offer is a clear, gradual developmental sequence leading up to this point. There is no lengthy fossil record of proto-writing evolving slowly into cuneiform, no clear line of increasingly sophisticated agricultural settlements building steadily toward Uruk and Eridu. Civilization in Sumer appears to begin, essentially, already finished. This observation is not itself controversial or fringe. It is acknowledged, in more cautious language, by mainstream archaeologists themselves, who refer to Sumer's early development as unusually rapid and who continue to debate the precise mechanisms behind what is sometimes called the Uruk phenomenon, the astonishingly quick spread of Sumerian urban culture, administrative technology, and trade networks across the wider region within a few centuries. The standard academic explanation involves a confluence of favorable environmental conditions, population pressure, and the organizational demands of large-scale irrigation agriculture, driving rapid social complexity, a process modern scholarship increasingly treats as gradual once you account for less visible precursor settlements at sites like Tel Brak and earlier Ubaid period communities. The ancient astronaut framework offers a considerably more direct explanation, one drawn straight from the tablets themselves rather than inferred from settlement patterns, that civilization did not develop gradually in Sumer because it was not, in the conventional sense, developed by the Sumerians at all. It was, according to the tablet's own account, delivered. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important and strangest documents to survive from the ancient world, opens with a sentence that has troubled and fascinated scholars since its rediscovery. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The text then proceeds to list a sequence of pre-flood kings, several of them ruling for periods rendered in the tens of thousands of years, figures modern scholars generally treat as symbolic, legendary, or the product of a numbering system whose true units we no longer fully understand, before the list breaks with the words, "Then the flood swept over," and resumes on the other side with a new sequence of kings, this time ruling for periods far closer to normal human lifespans, beginning at the city of Kish. This transition, pre-flood kings with vast, seemingly impossible lifespans, giving way abruptly after the flood to kings with ordinary human lifespans, is presented by ancient astronaut researchers as a direct textual record of the shift covered in Part 5, a world initially ruled by long-lived Anunnaki themselves or by their earliest closely related hybrid offspring, giving way, after the flood's population bottleneck, to a world increasingly governed by more distantly related, shorter-lived human administrators, operating under Anunnaki instruction and, crucially, under Anunnaki-granted legitimacy. According to the broader body of Sumerian and Akkadian mythological texts, this instruction took the form of a specific cataloged set of technologies and forms of knowledge. The tablets describe the Anunnaki deliberately transmitting to humanity in the period following the flood, a body of gifts collectively referred to in Sumerian religious literature by the term Mi, usually translated as something like divine ordinances or civilized attributes, and enumerated in a text called Inanna and the God of Wisdom, in a list that reads, to modernize, remarkably like an inventory of foundational civilizational technologies rather than abstract religious blessings. Kingship itself, the priesthood, truth, descent into and ascent from the underworld, the crafts of the carpenter, the smith, the leather worker, the mason, and the basket weaver, wisdom, the art of writing, the making of decisions, the art of song and music, the kindling of strife, and dozens of others spanning both practical technical skill and abstract social and administrative concepts, presented together as a single coherent package, transferred, according to the myth, in a single dramatic episode from Enki's city of Eridu to Inanna's city of Uruk. This is a genuinely unusual detail worth dwelling on, because most human civilizations, as far as the archaeological and anthropological record shows, develop their technologies piecemeal over centuries or millennia. Agriculture here, writing there, metallurgy somewhere else entirely, often independently invented in multiple separated regions of the globe at different points in time. Sumerian tradition, by contrast, describes something closer to a single, deliberate technology transfer, a complete civilizational starter kit handed over at more or less one time by a specific figure to a specific city, and the archaeological record of Sumer's own emergence, whatever one makes of the mythological framing, does show an unusually rapid, unusually complete arrival of interconnected technologies within a short window, rather than the slower, staggered pattern seen almost everywhere else in the ancient world. Whether this reflects an actual historical technology transfer or simply the natural tendency of any centralized administrative bureaucracy to accelerate innovation once irrigation agriculture created the population, density, and food surplus necessary to support specialists no longer tied to farming, again, remains a matter of interpretation. This series does not claim to resolve definitively. Both explanations remain live possibilities and are not, in truth, entirely mutually exclusive, since a technologically advanced outside actor accelerating an already favorable environmental situation is a perfectly coherent hybrid explanation as well. What the tablets are considerably more specific and more confident about is the underlying political structure this technology transfer served, and it is this structure, more than any single invention, that the ancient astronaut framework identifies as the true organizing principle of early Sumerian civilization. Each major city in Mesopotamia, the tablets consistently describe, was not simply a human settlement that happened to build a temple to a patron deity in the way later, more abstract polytheistic religions would organize themselves. Each city was, according to this reading, a literal operational estate belonging to a specific named Anunnaki commander, its central temple complex, the ziggurat, functioning not primarily as a place of symbolic worship, but as the actual administrative and residential center of that commander's local authority, staffed by a professional priesthood whose original function, before the role gradually became more purely religious and ceremonial over subsequent centuries, more closely resembled that of a palace bureaucracy, managing food distribution, organizing labor, maintaining astronomical and calendrical records, and serving as the direct communication interface between the ruling Anunnaki authority and the general human population. Eridu, as already established, belonged to Enki, its layered ziggurat structure entombing, according to archaeological excavation, an increasingly elaborate sequence of earlier, more modest temple structures built directly atop one another across thousands of years of continuous religious use, a pattern of continuous rebuilding on the exact same sacred footprint that itself supports the idea of an unusually long, unusually stable institutional continuity at this specific site, longer than almost any other continuously used religious site anywhere on Earth. Nippur belonged to Enlil and functioned, according to the tablets, as something closer to the administrative capital of the entire Anunnaki operation on Earth, home to the Anunnaki equivalent of a central command and communications facility the tablets refer to using a term researchers have translated as the Dur-An-Ki, meaning roughly, the bond of heaven and earth, a facility whose described function, coordinating communication and monitoring activity across the wider Anunnaki network on the planet, has led some researchers to characterize it as an ancient mission control, the beating administrative heart of an off-world operation, rather than merely the ceremonial seat of a regional deity. Ur, further south, belonged to Nanar, known also as Sin, a son of Enlil associated throughout the tablets with the moon, and whose city would rise, centuries later, to become one of the greatest and wealthiest urban centers in the ancient Near East. Home to the family of a man named Abram, later renamed Abraham, whose own migration out of Ur and into Canaan, this series will argue in a later part, may itself have been directly connected to political upheaval within the Anunnaki command structure, rather than simple independent religious inspiration. Sippar, further north, held particular significance in the tablets as a site closely associated with Utu, also known as Shamash, twin sibling of the goddess Inanna, and a figure the tablets repeatedly connect with aviation, sky travel, and what several researchers have argued was the location of an actual spaceport facility, a claim this series will examine in considerably more technical detail in Part 8, alongside the parallel and even more striking case of Baalbek in modern Lebanon, home to a stone platform built from megalithic blocks of a size and precision that remain, to this day, difficult to fully explain using the tools and techniques conventionally attributed to the ancient world. This, then, was the shape of the post-flood world the tablets describe. Not a single unified human kingdom, and not, contrary to later idealized retellings, a peaceful golden age of divine benevolence, but a patchwork of city-states, each one a semi-autonomous fiefdom under the direct or indirect authority of a specific named Anunnaki commander, their human populations growing, their kings increasingly assertive, and their patron deities increasingly prone, according to a growing body of tablets covering the centuries that followed, to jealousy, rivalry, and outright warfare with one another, disputes that would eventually draw the human populations under their authority directly into conflicts whose true stakes, according to the ancient astronaut framework, had far less to do with human politics than with succession disputes, territorial boundaries, and old, unresolved grievances stretching back to the very first days of the mission on Earth and the two half-brothers, Enki and Enlil, who never stopped competing for ultimate authority over it. That deepening rivalry, its eventual formalization into a fixed pantheon with clearly defined ranks and responsibilities, and the detailed profiles of the individual Anunnaki commanders whose names would echo for 4,000 years across the mythology of the entire ancient world, from Sumer to Egypt to Greece. The pantheon, faces of the command structure. To understand everything that follows in this series, from the wars of the gods, to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, to the eventual withdrawal of the Anunnaki from direct rule over Earth, it is necessary to lay out, clearly and in one place, exactly who the major figures in this story were, how they were ranked, and how their relationships to one another shaped 4,000 years of recorded human religious tradition. The Sumerians themselves were meticulous about this hierarchy, assigning each major deity a specific numerical rank within a system based on the number 60, the same base 60 mathematics that still survives today in our division of the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees. This was not vague, mystical religious hierarchy. It was, according to the tablets, an organizational chart, precise enough that scribes could and did argue over whether a given deity's rank had been correctly recorded on a given monument. At the absolute top of this structure stood Anu, ranked 60, the highest number in the system, ruler of Nibiru itself, who appears in the earliest tablets as a distant, largely off-world authority, visiting Earth only during moments of genuine crisis, such as the miners' revolt covered in Part 1, but otherwise governing from the home planet, delegating direct authority over the Earth mission to his sons. Anu's household situation, seemingly a minor domestic detail, turns out to be the single most consequential fact in this entire narrative, because Anu fathered two sons who would each go on to command separate branches of the Earth mission, and the circumstances of their birth would generate a rivalry that never fully resolved across the following several thousand years of tablets. His firstborn son was Enki, ranked 40, born to a wife named Nimu, believed by some researchers to have been a half-sister to Anu, a common practice among the Nibiruan ruling elite intended, according to the tablets, to keep bloodlines and, crucially, gold-related trade privileges concentrated within a small ruling circle. But under Nibiruan succession law, as it is described across multiple tablets, the firstborn son of a lesser wife did not automatically inherit supreme authority. That right belonged instead to the firstborn son of Anu's principal, full-blood half-sister wife, a woman named Antu, and that son was Enlil, ranked 50, 10 points senior to his older half-brother Enki, despite having been born later, purely by virtue of his mother's higher-ranking bloodline. This single fact, an inheritance law privileging bloodline purity over birth order, is the hinge on which the entire mythological history of the ancient Near East turns. Enki, older, more experienced, the mission's original commander, the engineer who had built Eridu with his own hands, and who had personally overseen humanity's creation, was permanently and formally subordinate to his younger half-brother, a rigid, rule-following administrator whose primary qualification for supreme authority on Earth was not competence or experience, but genealogical technicality. Every conflict this series covers from this point forward, the flood, the destruction of Sodom, the Tower of Babel, the eventual withdrawal of the Anunnaki, can be traced back, at least in part, to this original, unresolved grievance, and to the very different governing philosophies each brother developed as a result of it. Enki, the passed-over elder, consistently sympathetic to humanity, consistently inclined toward sharing knowledge and expanding human capability, arguably because doing so gave him leverage and legacy he could not claim through formal rank. And Enlil, the legally entitled younger brother, consistently rigid, consistently protective of hierarchy and boundary, and consistently suspicious of anything that threatened the established chain of command, including an increasingly capable human species. Below these two brothers, the tablets describe a substantial extended family, each member assigned specific domains, cities, and responsibilities. Ninhursag, ranked 40 like her half-brother Enki, and according to several tablets, also a half-sister to both Enki and Enlil through yet another of Anu's wives, served as the mission's chief medical and genetic officer, the figure most directly responsible for the actual physical creation of the human species described in Part 2, and who maintained, across the tablets, a role as something close to a neutral arbiter between her two, more openly antagonistic half-brothers, respected by both, and credited in several texts with personally brokering peace agreements between them during moments of open conflict. Ninhursag's title, Lady of the Mountain, and her strong association with birth, healing, and medicine has led numerous researchers to trace a direct line from her iconography to later goddess figures across the ancient world, including aspects of the Egyptian goddess Isis and, considerably more speculatively, to the enduring mother goddess archetype found in cultures worldwide. Enlil's sons carried forward his branch of the command structure. Ninurta, described as Enlil's firstborn and chief military commander, is credited across numerous tablets with fighting on his father's behalf in several of the major conflicts this series will cover in later parts, and is generally identified by researchers as the figure who later Assyrian and Babylonian tradition would elevate into their own primary war god. Nannar, also called Sin, ruled the city of Ur and was associated throughout Mesopotamian iconography with the moon, a role that made him and his cult center enormously influential across the wider ancient Near East, given the central importance of lunar observation to virtually every ancient calendar system. Nannar in turn fathered twins, Utu, also called Shamash, associated with the sun and, as noted in Part 6, with sky travel and aviation, in a manner that has made him a figure of particular interest to ancient astronaut researchers examining sites like Sippar, and his sister Inanna, also called Ishtar, arguably the single most vivid, most independently willful, and most extensively documented figure in the entire Sumerian pantheon, a goddess of love, war, and political ambition, whose exploits fill more surviving tablets than those of almost any other deity, and whose complicated, often turbulent relationships with mortal kings including a documented and unusually personal relationship with the historical king Sargon of Akkad, will be covered in detail in a later part of this series. Enki, for his part, fathered a son whose name would eventually eclipse every other deity in the entire pantheon and become, by the 2nd millennium BCE, the supreme god of the Babylonian Empire. Marduk, whose rise to ultimate power achieved not through inheritance, but through what the tablets describe as open political conflict, outright war, and, according to the reading, this series will present, in Part 8, a devastating use of what can only be described as weapons of mass destruction against rival Anunnaki-controlled cities in the region of the Dead Sea, represents the single most dramatic and consequential power struggle in the entire narrative, one that permanently reshaped the balance of authority among the Anunnaki, and, not coincidentally, coincides with a documented historical catastrophe in the archaeological record of the southern Jordan Valley that this series will examine directly and in detail. It is worth pausing here to address something that becomes obvious the moment you lay this family tree out in full: the overwhelming, near-total overlap between this specific cast of characters, their specific relationships, their specific domains, and the gods worshipped under different names across nearly every major civilization of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world for the following 3,000 years. Egyptian mythology's Ra, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus map with varying degrees of looseness onto structurally similar roles: a supreme, distant authority, a civilizing, sympathetic figure murdered or displaced by a rival family member, a powerful, protective mother goddess, and a younger generation locked in conflict over rightful succession. Greek mythology's Titans and Olympians, and the specific succession conflict between Cronus and Zeus, echo the same structural template of an older generation being displaced, violently or through political maneuvering, by a younger one. Canaanite mythology, recovered largely from tablets found at the site of ancient Ugarit, describes a supreme god named El, a storm and kingship god named Baal, and a fertility and war goddess named Anat, in relationships that map with startling closeness onto the Anu, Enlil, or Ninurta, and Inanna structure already established in Sumer centuries earlier. Mainstream comparative mythology has documented these parallels extensively for well over a century, generally attributing them to the well-established historical process of cultural diffusion and syncretism, as trade, migration, and conquest carried religious ideas and iconography outward from Mesopotamia, the demonstrably oldest literate civilization in the region, into neighboring cultures who then adapted and renamed these figures according to their own local languages, values, and political needs, a process abundantly documented in the historical record through direct textual borrowing, shared iconographic motifs on cylinder seals and temple reliefs, and explicit ancient commentary from later cultures themselves acknowledging Mesopotamian religious influence. The ancient astronaut framework accepts this same basic mechanism of cultural transmission, but argues that what was being transmitted across these different renamed pantheons was not merely abstract religious symbolism invented independently and coincidentally converging on similar themes, but a genuine, if increasingly fragmented and mythologized, folk memory of one specific, real command structure, one extended family of physically present ruling beings, whose original names, relationships, rivalries, and specific historical actions gradually blurred and multiplied into what later appears, to modern eyes accustomed to thinking of ancient religion as pure invented symbolism, as an entirely separate and unrelated set of independent pantheons. Whichever explanation you find more persuasive, the practical result for the remainder of this story is the same: a single, consistent, traceable family, headquartered across a handful of specific, real, excavated cities in southern Iraq, whose internal disputes over authority, resources, and the treatment of the human species they had engineered would, according to the tablets, escalate over the following centuries into open warfare, fought not merely with the Bronze Age weapons available to the human armies caught in the middle, but, if the ancient astronaut reading of certain deeply strange and specific tablets is correct, with something considerably more devastating, deployed directly against several of the very cities this pantheon itself had founded. That war, its causes, its documented archaeological aftermath, and the ancient text that describes it in more graphic and more technically specific detail than almost any other passage in this entire body of literature. The weapon that fell on the cities of the plain. Genesis chapter 19 describes one of the most abrupt and violent episodes in the entire Hebrew Bible. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities of the plain near the Dead Sea, obliterated in what the text describes as a rain of brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. An event so total that the text says Abraham, watching from a distance the next morning, saw smoke rising from the land as the smoke of a furnace, and that Lot's wife, disobeying an instruction not to look back at the destruction, was turned into a pillar of salt. Generations of readers have taken this as a straightforward account of divine punishment for the moral corruption of these two cities. But set beside the wider Mesopotamian textual tradition, and beside a body of physical and geological evidence from the southern Dead Sea region that this series will lay out plainly, the ancient astronaut framework proposes a considerably more literal and considerably more disturbing reading of what actually happened there. The broader Mesopotamian context for this event is provided by a group of tablets describing what researchers, following Sitchin's terminology, have come to call the Pyramid Wars, a prolonged conflict fought among the Anunnaki themselves, with human armies drawn into the fighting as proxies, over control of the region's most strategically vital assets, the spaceport facilities used to launch and land craft traveling to and from Nibiru, and the mission control and communications infrastructure covered in Part 6. According to this reading, the conflict's root cause traces directly back to the succession dispute established in Part 7. Marduk, Enki's firstborn son, increasingly frustrated by his own subordinate position within a command hierarchy that favored Enlil's line by birthright rather than by competence, began, according to the tablets, actively asserting a claim to supreme authority over the Earth mission, a claim that inevitably brought him into direct conflict with Enlil's descendants, particularly Ninurta, Enlil's designated military commander, who had by this point in the narrative been granted formal authority over the very spaceport facilities Marduk sought to control. The tablets describing this conflict, most extensively a text sometimes called the Era Epic, alongside fragments of what researchers term the War of the Kings texts, describe a shifting, multi-generational struggle involving alliances and betrayals among the wider Anunnaki family, fought across a span of decades and drawing in the human kings of several Mesopotamian city-states as combatants, each fighting nominally in their own city's interest, but, according to this reading, actually serving as instruments in a succession dispute whose real stakes lay entirely beyond their comprehension or control. It is within the final, climactic phase of this conflict, according to Sitchin's specific and heavily contested reconstruction, that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is said to have taken place, not as an isolated act of divine judgment against a morally corrupt population, but as a deliberate, tactical strike intended to permanently destroy the spaceport facility that the tablets place in the immediate vicinity of the cities of the plain, denying it to a rival faction, rather than allowing it to fall under Marduk's control, with the surrounding human population, guilty of nothing beyond unfortunate proximity, suffering the same devastating consequences as the strategic target itself. The nature of the weapon used is where this reading becomes most explicitly, and most controversially, technological, rather than purely mythological. The Genesis account describes fire and brimstone falling from the sky, an overwhelming, near instantaneous destruction, smoke rising afterward in a manner explicitly compared to smoke rising from a furnace, and a landscape left permanently altered, and, in the text's own words, uninhabitable. Sitchin and later researchers working from his framework have argued that this description, read without the assumption that it must be purely symbolic, aligns closely enough with the effects of a low-yield nuclear or similarly advanced directed energy weapon to warrant serious consideration. An intense, instantaneous fireball, a rising column of smoke and debris consistent with the mushroom cloud imagery later generations would only develop vocabulary for after 1945, an environment left contaminated and uninhabitable for an extended period afterward, and, most provocatively, the fate of Lot's wife, transformed instantly into a standing pillar of salt or mineral residue, a detail some researchers have controversially compared to the phenomenon of shadow figures, the near instantaneous vaporization or fusion of a human body into surrounding material, documented at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when individuals were caught in the immediate flash of a nuclear detonation, leaving behind only an outline or residue at the point of exposure. It is essential to state clearly that this comparison remains firmly outside any mainstream scholarly or scientific consensus and rests on a literal reading of a 3,000-year-old religious text, rather than on physical forensic evidence from the event itself, and it should be weighed accordingly. What is not purely speculative, and what does connect this discussion to genuine, independently conducted geological and archaeological research, is the physical condition of the southern Dead Sea Plain itself. The region contains the ruins of several Bronze Age settlements, including sites identified by biblical archaeologists as candidates for the historical Sodom and Gomorrah, most prominently Tal el-Hammam in modern Jordan. Excavated over more than a decade by a research team whose findings, published in a peer-reviewed 2021 paper in the journal Scientific Reports, documented evidence the researchers themselves described as consistent with an airburst event, a cosmic impact, or atmospheric detonation, similar in scale and mechanism to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, dated to approximately 1650 BCE. The paper's authors documented extremely high-temperature melted pottery, quartz grains showing shock fracturing consistent with sudden extreme pressure, and a layer of destruction debris containing unusually high concentrations of salt, potentially explaining, entirely through natural geological mechanisms, both the site's sudden, catastrophic abandonment and the biblical tradition's specific and otherwise puzzling emphasis on salt as a defining feature of the destruction. It is critical to be precise and honest about what this research does and does not establish. The Tal el-Hammam research team's own published conclusion identifies the likely cause as a natural cosmic airburst event, comparable to a meteor or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere, not an artificial weapon of any kind, extraterrestrial or human-made. And the paper has, like most single-site archaeological claims of this magnitude, drawn both support and significant methodological criticism from other specialists in the field, with some researchers questioning the dating evidence and the airburst interpretation of the site's destruction layer. What the research does establish, at minimum, is that a real Bronze Age settlement in the specific geographic region associated with the biblical account of Sodom did suffer a documented, sudden, high-temperature catastrophic destruction event, at a scale and character considerably beyond ordinary warfare or accidental fire, providing a genuine physical archaeological anchor for a story long treated by many scholars as purely legendary. The ancient astronaut framework does not require rejecting the mainstream cosmic airburst explanation to remain internally consistent. It simply proposes an alternative causal mechanism, a deliberate strike rather than a natural impact, for producing broadly the same category of catastrophic thermal destruction the physical evidence at the site clearly shows did occur. The tablets describing the broader pyramid wars go on to record consequences extending far beyond the immediate destruction of the two cities, describing what researchers have translated as an evil wind, a lingering contamination carried across the wider region by prevailing weather patterns in the aftermath of the attack, an effect the tablets associate with crop failure, illness, and the abandonment of formerly productive agricultural land across a wide surrounding area, a description that, if taken as anything more than poetic exaggeration, aligns unsettlingly well with the documented effects of radioactive or chemical fallout drifting downwind from a detonation site, contaminating land far beyond the immediate blast zone itself for an extended period afterward. Some ancient astronaut researchers have further connected this evil wind tradition to the otherwise puzzling and historically real collapse of the Sumerian heartland itself in the centuries that followed, a well-documented period of severe agricultural decline, soil salinization, and depopulation across southern Mesopotamia that conventional archaeology attributes primarily to long-term over-irrigation, gradually poisoning the region's soil with accumulated salt, a slow-moving environmental catastrophe extensively documented in the archaeological and paleoclimatic record, and one that does not, in the mainstream account, require or particularly support a connection to fallout from a weapon used against cities several hundred miles to the southwest. Whichever explanation ultimately proves correct for the specific destruction of the cities of the plain, natural cosmic airburst, as the excavating archaeologists themselves concluded, deliberate weapon, as the ancient astronaut framework proposes, or some reading in between the two, the underlying tablets are unambiguous about one further consequence that reshaped the entire remaining course of this story. The destruction of the region's spaceport, whatever caused it, forced a wholesale relocation of Anunnaki mission control operations. A relocation, the tablets describe moving primary command functions away from the older Mesopotamian heartland and toward a new center of power. The tablets associate closely with the rising authority of Marduk himself, in the city that would soon become the greatest and most feared power in the entire ancient Near East, Babylon. That relocation, Marduk's consolidation of supreme authority, the extraordinary and highly literal-sounding text known as the Enuma Elish, describing his formal elevation above all other gods, and the enormous, ambitious, and ultimately unfinished construction project the Bible remembers as the Tower of Babel. Babylon and the Tower. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, partially introduced in Part 1 for its account of the solar system's formation, was not simply a cosmological text describing the origins of the universe in the abstract. Its final, and, for the Babylonians themselves, most politically important sections serve a very specific and very worldly purpose, establishing, in explicit theological terms, the supremacy of Marduk over every other deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, including Anu, Enlil, and every other figure whose seniority and rank had, for well over 1,000 years of Sumerian tradition, been considered fixed and beyond dispute. The text describes an assembly of the gods, faced with an existential threat. In the epic's cosmological framing, this threat is Tiamat, but many researchers reading the text as a garbled record of the real Pyramid Wars conflict, covered in Part 8, see this section as a mythologized account of the actual military crisis facing the Anunnaki command structure at the time, granting Marduk emergency supreme command specifically because none of the traditionally senior gods, including Enlil himself, proved capable of resolving the crisis. And, crucially, the tablets describe this emergency authority becoming permanent once the crisis passed, with the assembled gods formally declaring Marduk supreme ruler and reciting, in a section of the text scholars have long recognized as unusual in its structure, 50 separate names and titles, one by one, effectively absorbing the identities, functions, and worshipped attributes of 50 separate, previously distinct deities into Marduk alone. This is, from a straightforward historical and political perspective, entirely consistent with what we independently know happened to the city of Babylon itself in the real historical record. Babylon was, for most of early Sumerian history, a relatively minor settlement, overshadowed by older, more prestigious centers like Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu. It was only considerably later, under the historical king Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, and even more dramatically under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, nearly 1,000 years after that, that Babylon rose to become the preeminent political and religious capital of the entire region, a rise mainstream historians attribute to conventional factors, strategic geographic position along key trade and river routes, and the political and military accomplishments of specific historical kings. The Enuma Elish's theological narrative of Marduk's supreme elevation functions, under any reading, at minimum as religious propaganda, composed and formally recited during Babylon's annual New Year festival, specifically to provide divine legitimacy for the city's very real, very worldly political dominance over older rival cities, whose own patron gods, Enlil at Nippur foremost among them, had previously held that same position of unquestioned supremacy for well over 1,000 years. The ancient astronaut framework does not dispute this basic historical and political reading, but layers an additional claim on top of it, that this theological transition from a shared, ranked pantheon to Marduk's singular supreme authority records something more than mere political propaganda accompanying Babylon's ordinary historical rise. It records, in this reading, the actual, literal outcome of the succession conflict introduced in Part 7 and detailed in Part 8, Marduk's decades-long struggle against Enlil's line finally succeeding, whether through military victory, political maneuvering, or simply outlasting and outmaneuvering rivals across a long enough span of time, in establishing himself as the effective supreme authority over the Earth mission, a claim the tablets suggest was bitterly, but ultimately unsuccessfully, contested by the remainder of Enlil's descendants, who are described in several later fragmentary texts, continuing to challenge Marduk's legitimacy for generations afterward. A lingering succession dispute, some researchers argue, never fully resolved before the Anunnaki's eventual withdrawal from direct rule over humanity altogether. A withdrawal this series will examine directly in Part 11. It is against this backdrop of Marduk's consolidating power that the biblical account of the Tower of Babel takes on a considerably sharper political edge than its familiar Sunday school retelling usually conveys. Genesis chapter 11 describes a unified humanity, speaking a single common language, migrating to the plain of Shinar, precisely the region of southern Mesopotamia this entire series has been discussing, and beginning construction of a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, explicitly stated in the text as an act intended to make us a name, to consolidate and assert human power and unity, and, the text says, to prevent humanity from being scattered across the face of the earth. The response described in Genesis is not gentle. The text has the Lord, again using the same plural construction encountered previously in Genesis regarding Adam's expulsion from Eden, saying, "Let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." A deliberate act of division, following which the text says humanity was scattered across the earth, unable to communicate, and construction of the tower was permanently abandoned. Conventional theological reading treats this episode as a straightforward parable about human hubris, humanity overreaching, attempting to rival heaven itself through its own collective ambition and technological achievement, and receiving a humbling, divisive punishment as a direct consequence. The ancient astronaut framework proposes a considerably more literal and more strategically specific reading, one grounded in the archaeological reality of what a Mesopotamian ziggurat, the structure most scholars agree the biblical tower is describing, actually was, not a fanciful attempt to physically climb into the sky, but, as established in Part 6, the central administrative, religious, and communications facility of a specific Anunnaki-controlled city, and, according to several tablets, specifically associated in this instance with Marduk's newly ascendant city of Babylon itself, a massive new ziggurat construction project that later Babylonian records identify by name as the Anunnaki, meaning the foundation of heaven and earth, a structure whose surviving base foundations, excavated by German archaeologists in the early 20th century, confirm it was among the largest ziggurat structures ever built in Mesopotamian history, a genuine, physically real mega-project whose scale would indeed have made a powerful and threatening statement to any rival power observing its construction. Read this way, the confusion of languages takes on a very different character than simple divine punishment for prideful ambition. Several researchers working from the ancient astronaut framework have proposed that the described confounding of a previously unified human language represents a deliberate act of strategic sabotage carried out by a rival faction within the Anunnaki command structure, most plausibly Enlil's remaining line, still contesting Marduk's claim to supremacy, aimed specifically at crippling Marduk's ability to coordinate and unify the large cooperative human workforce required to complete such an enormous, symbolically and strategically significant construction project, deliberately fracturing the linguistic unity of the surrounding human population specifically to prevent Babylon's political and religious dominance from being physically cemented in stone at the very moment it appeared closest to succeeding. Under this reading, the story is not about humanity being punished for its own ambition, but about humanity being caught, once again, as it so often is, throughout this entire body of tablets, in the middle of an internal Anunnaki power struggle, whose true causes and true stakes it had no ability to see or understand, left afterward only with a fractured, scattered, mutually unintelligible collection of language groups as the lasting, visible residue of a fight that was never actually about them. Whatever the true cause, the linguistic diversification of the ancient Near East and the broader ancient world is, of course, an entirely real and extensively documented historical and linguistic phenomenon. One modern historical linguistics traces through well-established gradual processes of population divergence, migration, and natural language change occurring over very long spans of time, a mainstream explanation that requires no single dramatic, instantaneous divisive event at all, and that stands as the overwhelming academic consensus on how the world's language families actually developed. The Genesis accounts compression of this slow, gradual, genuinely millennia-long linguistic process into a single dramatic episode at a single tower in a single generation is, under the mainstream reading, understood as a common feature of ancient ideological storytelling, condensing a real but gradual phenomenon into a single memorable, teachable narrative moment, precisely as the Genesis flood account condenses a genuinely gradual, multi-century process of post-glacial sea level rise into a single 40-day storm. By this point in the narrative, roughly 2,000 years into recorded human history, according to the chronology this series has been following, the pattern should be clear. Humanity's greatest triumphs and greatest catastrophes in this reading are consistently framed not as the product of purely human decisions and purely human conflicts, but as the visible surface disturbance of a much older, much less visible conflict playing out above and around them between beings whose motives, rank, and grievances stretched back far earlier than any human civilization existed to witness their origin. It is at exactly this point in the tablets, in the centuries following Babel and the consolidation of Marduk's power, that a new and pivotal figure enters the story, a man whose family, according to the book of Genesis itself, came directly from the city of Nannar, Enlil's grandson, at precisely the moment, this series will argue, that Enlil's line was suffering its most significant political defeat at Marduk's hands. A man named Abram, later renamed Abraham, whose covenant with a deity identified across the text simply as the Lord, and whose family's specific, repeated, and unusually direct encounters with beings described in strikingly physical, non-abstract terms throughout the remainder of Genesis. Abraham and the family that walked with gods. Genesis chapter 11, in the very same section of the text that concludes the Tower of Babel narrative covered in part 9, introduces a genealogy that leads directly to a man named Abram and states plainly and without embellishment that his father, Terah, took his family, including Abram and Abram's nephew Lot, from Ur of the Chaldees, intending to journey to the land of Canaan, before settling instead partway along that route in the city of Haran. This is, on its face, a simple migration narrative, but the specific point of origin named in the text carries enormous weight given everything established across the previous 9 parts of this series. Ur was Nannar's city, the cult center of Enlil's grandson, and according to the historical record independent of any biblical or Sumerian source, one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated, most politically important urban centers in the entire ancient Near East during the exact period, roughly the early 2nd millennium BCE, most biblical scholars associate with Abraham's traditional dating. The excavations conducted at Ur in the 1920s and 1930s by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley remain among the most significant in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology, uncovering a city of remarkable wealth and sophistication, elaborate royal tombs containing gold jewelry, musical instruments, and evidence of large-scale ritual sacrifice accompanying royal burials, alongside private residential neighborhoods of genuinely comfortable, multi-room houses that Woolley himself, in his own published accounts, explicitly compared to the standard of living of a prosperous English middle-class suburb of his own era, a detail worth dwelling on because it directly contradicts the common popular image of Abraham as a simple, itinerant desert nomad. If the traditional dating and location are accurate, Abraham's family did not emerge from primitive, unlettered tribal obscurity. They emerged from the beating heart of one of the wealthiest, most literate, and most religiously sophisticated cities on earth at that time, a city whose entire civic and religious life, as established in Part 6, was organized directly around the cult, the priesthood, and the physical estate of Nannar, one specific, named member of the Anunnaki family this series has been tracing since Part 1. Read against the backdrop established in Part 9, Terah and Abram's departure from Ur takes on a considerably sharper political dimension than the traditional reading of a man simply called by God to leave his homeland for a distant, unspecified promised land. This was, according to the chronology this series has laid out, a period of significant upheaval within the Anunnaki command structure, Marduk's line ascendant and consolidating power in Babylon at the direct expense of Enlil's remaining authority and influence across the older Sumerian heartland, including, plausibly, at Ur itself. Several ancient astronaut researchers have proposed that Abram's departure represents, at least in part, a genuine historical displacement, a family connected to Nanner's priesthood or administrative apparatus choosing, or being compelled, to relocate away from a city whose patron deity's fortunes were visibly declining toward territory further west in Canaan that may have remained more directly under the protection or influence of a different branch of the Anunnaki family altogether. Quite possibly, given everything that follows in Abraham's story, under the more direct personal patronage of Enlil's line itself, a patronage the biblical text goes on to describe in language of startling, sustained, and repeated physical directness. The deity Abraham interacts with throughout Genesis is referred to using several distinct Hebrew names and titles, a detail long recognized by biblical scholars as evidence of multiple, originally separate source traditions later combined into a single composite text, a scholarly framework known as the documentary hypothesis. Among the most significant of these titles is Elohim, a grammatically plural Hebrew word literally meaning gods, used throughout the earliest chapters of Genesis, and El Shaddai, a title of somewhat disputed etymology, traditionally rendered God Almighty, but which several researchers, including Sitchin, have connected instead to a Semitic root associated with mountains, or more provocatively, with an Akkadian root Shadu, meaning specifically a mountain used for a particular administrative or observational purpose, potentially connecting the title directly to the kind of Anunnaki command and control facility described in Part 6. What is not disputed by any serious reading of the text, mainstream or otherwise, is the strikingly physical, direct, and repeated nature of Abraham's actual encounters with this deity, encounters that read far more like documented meetings with a physically present, mobile, eating, speaking individual than like the abstract, unseen, omnipresent conception of God that later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic monotheism would eventually develop. Genesis chapter 18 contains perhaps the single most striking example in the entire Hebrew Bible of this physical directness. The text describes the Lord appearing to Abraham at his tent by the oaks of Mamre in the heat of the day in the specific and unambiguous form of three men standing before him. Abraham, the text says, ran to meet them, bowed, and personally arranged for water to be brought so they could wash their feet, a common and specific gesture of hospitality extended to actual physical travelers before instructing his household to prepare a genuine meal. Bread, a calf specifically slaughtered and prepared for the occasion, curds, and milk, which the text then explicitly states these three visitors sat down and ate under a tree in front of Abraham, who stood by them as they did so. Two of these three figures are subsequently identified in the following chapter as angels who travel onward to the city of Sodom, arriving in the evening where they are again offered a meal by Lot, again explicitly described as unleavened bread which they eat, before the chapter proceeds directly into the destruction of the city covered in detail in Part 8, one of the most striking direct textual connections in this entire series, tying the physically embodied meal-sharing visitors of chapter 18 directly to the catastrophic strike on the cities of the plain recorded immediately afterward in chapter 19. This is worth underscoring plainly. The Hebrew Bible, at one of its most theologically foundational moments, describes God or beings acting in extremely close and largely unexplained association with God, in terms that are not visionary, not symbolic, not mystical, but concretely, mundanely physical. They walk. They travel by foot across real geographic distance. They arrive hungry. They wash their feet from the dust of travel. They eat real prepared food in front of a human witness. And, in the very next chapter, one of them personally, physically strikes the men of Sodom blind when they attempt to assault Lot's household, before physically escorting Lot's family out of the city ahead of its destruction, taking Lot by the hand, the text specifies, when he hesitates. None of this reads, on a plain and literal examination of the text's own language, like an encounter with an abstract, incorporeal, omnipresent deity in the sense later theology would define one. It reads like an encounter with physically present, individually distinct beings, capable of ordinary physical action, ordinary physical need, and, when required, decisive physical intervention. The conventional theological explanation for these passages, developed extensively across centuries of Jewish and Christian scholarship, treats these physical manifestations as theophanies, temporary, divinely permitted physical appearances, allowing an otherwise incorporeal God to interact meaningfully with human beings within the constraints of human perception and human narrative, a doctrine that remains entirely coherent within an orthodox theological framework, and that the overwhelming majority of biblical scholars and religious authorities continue to hold as the correct interpretation of these passages. The ancient astronaut framework does not require rejecting this theological reading outright to make its case, but it does propose a more economical explanation for the same textual evidence, that these passages describe exactly what they appear on their plain surface language, to describe without requiring an additional interpretive layer of theophany to explain away the meals, the foot washing, the travel, and the physical touch, because the beings in question were not, in this reading, an incorporeal deity manifesting temporarily in physical form at all, but were simply and directly physically embodied members of the Anunnaki family. This series has been tracing since part 1, continuing well into the 2nd millennium BCE, the same pattern of direct, personal, physically present interaction with select human individuals that the earlier Sumerian tablets describe Enki, Enlil, and their extended family, engaging in with human kings and favored humans for well over 1,000 years before Abraham was ever born. Abraham's story continues well beyond this episode, of course, through the near sacrifice of his son Isaac, an episode this series will examine directly in a later part for its own startling parallels to Canaanite and broader ancient Near Eastern traditions of ritual and genetic testing, through his grandson Jacob's own direct physically wrestling encounter with a being the text identifies ambiguously as a man, an angel, and, in the same passage, as God himself, an encounter Jacob survives with a permanently altered hip, and onward into the story of Joseph, Egypt, and a captivity that will carry this narrative directly into the parallel and equally rich body of Anunnaki-derived tradition preserved not in Mesopotamia at all, but along the Nile, where the tablets and monuments of a civilization even more visibly obsessed with the direct, hereditary bloodline connection between its rulers and its gods have left behind some of the most extraordinary and least explained physical structures anywhere on the surface of the planet. That civilization, its own account of its gods, and the single most debated and most physically extraordinary structure in all of ancient history, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Nile, the Neteru, and the Great Pyramid. Ancient Egyptian civilization presents ancient astronaut researchers with a body of evidence in many ways even more provocative than the Mesopotamian material this series has spent the last 10 parts examining, precisely because so much of it survives not as fragile clay tablets buried for millennia, and only recently deciphered, but as enormous, still-standing stone monuments, visible, measurable, and climbable by any visitor to the Giza Plateau today. Egyptian religious tradition described its gods using the word Neteru, a term Egyptologists conventionally translate simply as gods, but whose more precise underlying meaning has long been debated, with some researchers, including several outside the ancient astronaut framework entirely, noting that the hieroglyphic determinative most closely associated with the term carries connotations closer to watchers or guardians than to divinity in a purely abstract, worshipful sense, a linguistic nuance that dovetails suggestively, though far from conclusively, with the Mesopotamian and biblical watcher terminology already covered in Part 4. Egyptian civilization, like Sumerian civilization before it, presents its own version of the sudden emergence puzzle discussed in Part 6. The transition from Egypt's late pre-dynastic period into the fully unified, fully hieroglyphic, monumentally constructing civilization of the Old Kingdom occurs within a historically compressed window, and Egyptian tradition itself, recorded by the 3rd century BCE Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, whose original work survives only in fragments quoted by later classical authors, describes a lengthy pre-dynastic period during which Egypt was ruled directly, not by human pharaohs at all, but by a sequence of gods and demigods, stretching back, in Manetho's own figures, tens of thousands of years before the reign of the first fully human, historically attested pharaoh, Menes. Mainstream Egyptology treats this king list tradition the same way it treats the pre-flood portion of the Sumerian king list, discussed in Part 6, as legendary, symbolic, or reflecting an extended, poorly understood, and likely exaggerated pre-dynastic chieftain tradition rather than literal history. The ancient astronaut framework proposes, consistent with its reading of the parallel Sumerian material, that Manetho's god-kings represent the same phenomenon already established across the previous 10 parts of this series, an extended initial period of direct Anunnaki rule, gradually transitioning, exactly as it did in Mesopotamia, into a period of human kingship, but with one critical difference that sets Egyptian tradition apart from every other ancient civilization this series has examined so far, a difference with enormous consequences for the following 3,000 years of Egyptian political and religious life. Where Mesopotamian human kings, even at their most exalted, were generally understood as servants, priests, or at most, favored intermediaries of their patron deity, ruling with divine sanction but not divine identity, Egyptian pharaohs made a considerably bolder and more specific claim that the pharaoh himself was not merely favored by the gods, but was, quite literally, a physical descendant of them, carrying divine bloodline directly in his veins, and, in the case of the god Horus specifically, was understood during his lifetime to be the living incarnation of that god walking the earth in human form, becoming, only upon his death, the god Osiris, Horus's father, in a continuous, unbroken cycle, repeated with every new pharaoh's coronation. This is an extraordinarily specific and extraordinarily literal genealogical claim, one Egyptian civilization enforced through a practice that has troubled and fascinated historians for centuries. Royal sibling marriage, brothers marrying sisters, sometimes half-siblings, sometimes in a small number of especially well-documented cases, full siblings, a practice virtually universally taboo among the general Egyptian population itself, but actively required, or at minimum strongly favored, within the royal family specifically, for a reason ancient Egyptian texts state with unusual directness, to preserve the purity and continuity of the specific divine bloodline the pharaoh was understood to carry. This detail connects directly back to the Nibiruan succession law established in Part 7, in which Anu's own supreme authority passed specifically through his full-blood half-sister wife, rather than through a lesser consort, a bloodline purity principle the Egyptian royal family appears to have adopted and enforced with even greater rigor and consistency than their Mesopotamian counterparts ever did. Ancient astronaut researchers have proposed that this near-identical obsession with bloodline purity across two entirely separate ancient civilizations is not coincidental cultural parallel, but reflects a shared, genuine underlying genetic concern that the specific hybrid Anunnaki-human genetic combination the pharaonic line claimed to carry, granting, according to Egyptian tradition, the pharaoh alone the unique capacity to serve as a living intermediary between the human and divine realms, was itself a delicate, easily diluted genetic trait, one that could only be reliably preserved and concentrated through the kind of close, controlled breeding practice the Egyptian royal family pursued with such extraordinary and otherwise difficult to explain consistency across 3 millennia of recorded dynastic history. No discussion of ancient astronaut claims connected to Egypt can avoid confronting directly the single most debated structure in this entire body of evidence, the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it is worth laying out the case and the serious counter-evidence as plainly and fairly as this format allows. The Great Pyramid, conventionally dated to the reign of the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, remains, even by the most conservative and thoroughly mainstream engineering assessment, an object of genuine and legitimate astonishment. Originally standing at approximately 481 feet, the tallest human-made structure on the planet for nearly 4,000 years afterward, constructed constructed from over 2 million individual limestone and granite blocks, some of the largest granite blocks used in the king's chamber ceiling, weighing in excess of 80 tons each, quarried at Aswan, over 500 miles south, and somehow transported and precisely positioned within the structure's interior. The pyramid's base is level to within a margin, conventional engineers themselves describe as extraordinary. Its four sides are oriented to true north, with an accuracy of a small fraction of 1 degree, and its original outer casing stones, largely stripped away over subsequent centuries for reuse in later construction, were finished and fitted with a precision multiple independent engineering assessments have described as effectively seamless. Gaps between adjacent blocks measured, where casing stones survive, at a fraction of an inch. Mainstream Egyptology maintains, based on an extensive body of archaeological evidence, including workers' villages, quarry marks, ancient construction ramps, and administrative papyri directly documenting labor organization and material logistics for pyramid-era construction projects, that the Great Pyramid was built by skilled, well-organized, well-fed Egyptian laborers, not, contrary to a popular but historically inaccurate misconception, by enslaved populations using ramps, sledges, levers, and an extremely sophisticated understanding of practical engineering, surveying, and quarrying techniques developed and refined over centuries of earlier smaller pyramid construction projects that can be traced in clear, gradual, technically legible developmental sequence, going back to the earlier step pyramid of Djoser. This gradual developmental sequence, unlike the sudden, unexplained emergence discussed elsewhere in this series regarding early Sumerian civilization, is genuinely well documented and widely accepted, and it represents the strongest single piece of evidence mainstream Egyptology offers against extraterrestrial or otherwise externally assisted construction. The Great Pyramid does not appear from nowhere, fully formed. It is the culmination of a clearly traceable engineering tradition, each earlier pyramid attempt visibly less refined, in some cases visibly flawed or collapsed, than the ones that followed. Ancient astronaut researchers do not generally dispute that human laborers, organized under Egyptian administrative authority, physically built the pyramid using physical human labor. Even Sitchin's own writing on the subject accepts substantial human involvement in the construction itself. What the ancient astronaut framework instead proposes is a more targeted and narrower claim that certain specific technical achievements within the pyramid's construction, the extraordinary precision of its leveling and orientation, the transportation and placement of multi-ton granite blocks with a degree of fitted precision, some modern stonemasons and engineers have publicly stated they would find genuinely challenging to replicate even using contemporary heavy machinery, and the structure's overall mathematical relationships, including its base perimeter divided by twice its height, yielding a value strikingly close to the mathematical constant pi. A precision numerous mainstream Egyptologists attribute to a plausible and reasonably well-documented ancient rope and peg surveying technique rather than to any deliberate encoding of advanced mathematics, required either direct technological assistance, surveying or lifting technology beyond what the conventional archaeological record otherwise directly documents for this period, or, in Sitchin's own considerably more radical and highly disputed specific claim, that the pyramid's original construction predates Khufu's reign entirely, and that the historically documented 4th Dynasty pyramid building program represents not original construction at all, but a later restoration and completion of a far older Anunnaki-built structure, a claim that finds essentially no support in mainstream Egyptological dating evidence, which relies on multiple independent and mutually reinforcing methods, including radiocarbon dating of organic material embedded directly within the mortar and construction fill, quarry marks bearing Khufu's own royal name, found within sealed internal relieving chambers inaccessible since the moment of original construction, and administrative papyri, most significantly the Diary of Merer discovered at Wadi al-Jarf in 2013, directly documenting a specific work crew's role transporting limestone for the pyramid's construction during Khufu's actual reign. This series presents the Great Pyramid discussion, more than perhaps any other single topic covered so far, as the clearest illustration of where the ancient astronaut framework's evidentiary strength genuinely varies by claim. The pyramid's engineering achievements are real, extensively documented, and continue to generate legitimate ongoing debate among mainstream engineers and Egyptologists themselves regarding the precise practical methods used to achieve such extraordinary results using Bronze Age tools and techniques. The specific claim that the structure predates Khufu's reign entirely, however, runs directly against a substantial, specific, and mutually reinforcing body of dating evidence that has only grown stronger, not weaker, with subsequent archaeological discovery over the decades since Sitchin first proposed it, and it remains, even among many researchers otherwise sympathetic to the broader ancient astronaut framework, one of the framework's least well-supported individual claims. What is considerably better supported, and considerably stranger, is the pyramid's own internal religious and astronomical function, as described directly in Egyptian funerary texts themselves. Texts that describe the structure not merely as a tomb, but as a kind of ascension device, a machine, in the language of the pyramid texts, intended to project the deceased pharaoh's spirit directly along a precisely calculated stellar alignment towards specific stars in the constellation Orion and the northern circumpolar sky, an interior architecture of narrow, precisely angled shafts running from the king's and queen's chambers directly toward these specific stellar targets that remains, regardless of any extraterrestrial framework, one of the most remarkable pieces of applied practical astronomy to survive from the ancient world, and the subject this series turns to directly in Part 12. Alongside the broader and equally contested question of Egypt's own flood and creation traditions, and a text describing flying vehicles, the Vimanas, that emerges not from Egypt or Mesopotamia at all, but from a body of ancient literature this series has not yet touched, the sacred texts of ancient India. Orion, the Vimanas, and a global pattern. Before leaving Egypt entirely, it is worth returning briefly to the interior architecture mentioned at the close of Part 11, because the so-called star shafts of the Great Pyramid represent one of the more carefully measured and less disputed pieces of evidence in this entire series, verified not primarily by ancient astronaut researchers, but by mainstream astronomers and Egyptologists working collaboratively, most notably in a series of studies conducted from the 1960s onward and refined considerably by the work of engineer Robert Bauval in the early 1990s. The narrow shaft extending from the king's chamber, when its ancient angle of inclination is projected outward and adjusted for the precession of the equinoxes back to approximately 2500 BCE, aligns with striking precision on the star Alnitak, the easternmost star in the belt of the constellation Orion, a constellation the ancient Egyptians themselves explicitly associated with the god Osiris in their own surviving religious texts. Bauval extended this observation into what has become known as the Orion correlation theory, proposing that the relative layout of the three main pyramids at Giza and several additional smaller pyramids in the wider Giza and Saqqara necropolis mirrors, with a degree of correspondence Bauval and his collaborators argue is too precise to be coincidental, the relative layout of the three stars of Orion's belt and the surrounding stars of that constellation as they would have appeared in the sky during this same period. The Orion correlation theory remains genuinely contested within professional Egyptology, with critics arguing that the correlation, while visually suggestive, involves selective measurement, a degree of flexibility in matching star brightness to relative pyramid size, and a broader methodological problem common to many pattern-matching claims of this kind. With enough freedom to select which stars to compare against which monuments, meaningful-looking correlations become considerably easier to construct than they might first appear. This series presents the theory neither as proven nor as disproven, but as a serious, mathematically grounded hypothesis advanced by a credentialed engineer and taken seriously enough to generate 2 decades of ongoing academic debate, rather than as a fringe claim dismissed outright by the field. And it is worth noting that whatever one concludes about the specific ground-to-sky correlation, the star shafts themselves, and their precise alignment toward specific, deliberately chosen stars are not in dispute. Only their broader symbolic and architectural significance remains genuinely open to interpretation. What makes this Orion-Osiris connection worth dwelling on within the framework of this series, specifically, is the way way it dovetails with material already established in earlier parts. Osiris, as introduced in Part 7, occupies a mythological role in Egyptian tradition remarkably similar to Enki's role in Mesopotamian tradition, a civilizing god credited with personally teaching humanity agriculture and law, murdered by a jealous rival within his own divine family, his brother Set, dismembered and ultimately restored, in Osiris's case, not to renewed earthly life, but to rulership of the underworld, and crucially for this discussion, to a specific stellar destination in the sky itself. If the broader ancient astronaut framework holds any validity at all, an actual physical point of departure and return, a genuine place these beings were understood to travel to and from, would be an entirely logical thing for a civilization who witnessed and mythologized such departures to eventually encode into its most sacred funerary architecture, a literal, physically oriented flight path built into stone, pointing not symbolically, but astronomically toward the specific place the pharaoh's spirit, and by extension the beings he claimed descent from, was believed to originate from and return to. This theme of physical, technologically described flight recurs with startling frequency across ancient literature far removed from both Egypt and Mesopotamia, and nowhere more extensively or more explicitly than in the sacred literature of ancient India, a body of texts this series has not yet examined directly, but which contains, by a considerable margin, the most detailed and most technically elaborate ancient descriptions of flying vehicles surviving anywhere in the ancient world. The Sanskrit epics, particularly the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, alongside a body of later technical literature, including the Samarangana, Sutradhara, and the widely discussed, but considerably more disputed, and almost certainly much later Vaimanika Shastra, describe flying vehicles called vimanas in language that goes well beyond vague poetic imagery of chariots crossing the sky, common enough across many ancient mythological traditions, into descriptions carrying specific, repeated technical detail, multiple decks, described mechanisms of propulsion involving mercury, and a rotating or vibrating internal component, defensive weapon systems, and, in several of the most frequently cited passages, detailed descriptions of aerial combat between rival vimanas, complete with described effects, blinding light, deafening sound, and devastating area-wide destruction that some researchers have compared, controversially and with considerable scholarly pushback, to the effects of advanced conventional or even nuclear weaponry. It is essential, in fairness to the current state of the actual scholarship, to be precise about which of these texts carry genuine antiquity and which do not, because this is an area where ancient astronaut popularization has, at times, significantly overstated its case in ways that have damaged the credibility of the broader field, even among its own more careful proponents. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are genuinely ancient texts, with core narrative material plausibly dating back in oral tradition to the 2nd millennium BCE, reaching their final written form by the early centuries of the Common Era, and their Vimana references, while considerably less mechanically detailed than later popular accounts often suggest, do describe flying chariot-like vehicles, some explicitly of non-human or divine origin, in the context of these epics' broader wars between gods, demigods, and human kings. The Vaimanika Shastra, by sharp contrast, the source of by far the most detailed and most frequently cited technical Vimana descriptions, including specific claimed metallurgical formulas and detailed cockpit layouts, is a text whose own claimed channeled origin dates to the early 20th century, first published in the 1950s, and whose claimed ancient source material has never been independently verified to predate this modern publication in any surviving earlier manuscript. A formal engineering analysis of the text's described vehicle, conducted by faculty at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore in 1974, concluded that the vehicle, as technically described, was aerodynamically non-functional and could not fly, a finding its own defenders have since disputed on various grounds, but which represents the most direct, credentialed engineering assessment the text has received. This series presents the Vaimanika Shastra's specific technical claims as unreliable and most plausibly a modern composition, while treating the older Ramayana and Mahabharata Vimana material on its own separate and considerably more legitimate ancient footing, genuinely ancient, genuinely describing flying vehicles associated with divine or semi-divine figures, but considerably vaguer and less technically specific than popular ancient astronaut literature frequently implies. What survives this more careful sorting, even after setting aside the Vaimanika Shastra's unreliable specifics, is nonetheless a genuinely striking pattern. Independent, geographically separated ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indian subcontinent each preserve traditions of specific, named, individually distinct, divine or semi-divine figures traveling through the sky in described vehicles, associated with specific technological capability, specific weapons, and specific catastrophic destructive potential when those capabilities were turned against rival powers or against humanity itself, a pattern this series has now traced through Nibiru's rocket-like MU vehicles in Sumer, through the Orion-aligned ascension architecture of Egypt's pyramids, and now through the Vimanas of the Indian epics, three entirely separate literary and religious traditions, developed by populations with limited to no direct contact with one another during the relevant periods of textual composition, each independently preserving a broadly similar core claim. Mainstream comparative mythology, as noted previously in Part 7 regarding the recurring divine conflict template, offers its own coherent explanation for this kind of cross-cultural pattern, one grounded in the observation that ancient peoples across the world independently and repeatedly projected their own most powerful and most feared human technologies, chariots, weapons of war, the raw, awe-inspiring power of storms and celestial phenomena like meteors and comets, onto their conceptions of divine power, a natural and well-documented human tendency toward anthropomorphizing and technologizing the forces that most impressed and most terrified them, requiring no shared historical contact or shared real technological event to explain the recurring motif of sky-traveling, weapon-wielding gods appearing independently across separated cultures. The ancient astronaut framework, once again, does not dispute that this psychological tendency exists and operates in ancient religious thought generally, but argues that the specificity, consistency, and internal technical coherence of these particular sky vehicle and weapon traditions, considered together across Sumer, Egypt, and India, exceeds what this general psychological tendency alone would predict, and is more economically explained as scattered, independently transmitted memory of a shared underlying historical reality, refracted through three separate cultural and linguistic lenses, than as three entirely coincidental, entirely independent flowerings of the same specific and unusual imaginative motif. This same pattern, once you begin looking for it, extends further still into traditions this series has not yet touched at all. The flying serpent god Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, described in Aztec and earlier Toltec tradition as a bearded, light-skinned, wisdom-bringing civilizer who arrived from across the Eastern Sea and departed with a promise of eventual return, a promise that would carry catastrophic historical consequences centuries later when Hernán Cortés arrived on Mexico's shores. The sky god Viracocha of the Inca, credited with civilizing an early, primitive humanity and associated with the extraordinary megalithic stonework at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Pumapunku, whose interlocking, precisely cut andesite blocks present engineering puzzles in some respects even more extreme than those of the Great Pyramid, and the Dogon people of Mali, whose traditional cosmology, first documented by French anthropologists in the 1930s, describes detailed astronomical knowledge of the Sirius star system, including a companion star invisible to the naked eye that would not be confirmed by Western astronomy using telescopic observation until decades after the Dogon tradition was first recorded, a claim that has generated its own extensive and unresolved academic controversy regarding the possibility of contamination from earlier European contact rather than genuine independent ancient knowledge. Each of these traditions, the Mesoamerican, the Andean, and the West African, carries its own extensive body of evidence, controversy, and counter-argument, more than this single part of the series can properly address, and each deserves the same careful, evidence-weighing treatment this series has attempted to apply to the Mesopotamian, biblical, and Egyptian material covered so far. It is to the Americas specifically, and to the astonishing, genuinely disputed megalithic stonework of the Andes that this series turns next in Part 13 before returning, in the parts that follow, to the central Mesopotamian narrative this series began with, and to its final, unresolved chapters, the slow withdrawal of the Anunnaki from direct rule over the human world, and the question every serious researcher in this field eventually has to confront directly, the question this entire series has been building toward from its very first paragraph. If they were real, and if they left, where did they go? And is there any credible reason to think they might still be watching? Viracocha and the Stones of the Andes. High on the Bolivian Altiplano, at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet, sits a ruined complex called Tiwanaku, and within it, a smaller associated structure called Pumapunku, whose scattered stone blocks present, by wide agreement even among conventional archaeologists who reject any extraterrestrial explanation for them, some of the most precisely cut and most difficult to satisfactorily explain stonework anywhere in the ancient world. The site's H-shaped andesite blocks, a volcanic stone with a hardness considerably greater than the limestone and granite used at Giza, display flat surfaces, internal right angles, and repeating standardized dimensions with a consistency that has led several independent structural and mechanical engineers examining the site outside of any ancient astronaut advocacy context to note in published and conference-presented assessments that reproducing this level of precision using only hand tools would be, at minimum, extraordinarily labor-intensive, and that the blocks show surface characteristics, extremely fine, uniform drill holes and flat-faced grooves, more commonly associated with mechanical rather than purely manual stoneworking techniques. Conventional archaeology's position on Tiwanaku and Pumapunku developed over decades of genuine excavation and dating work rather than speculation, places the site's main construction phases within the first millennium CE, built by the Tiwanaku culture that would eventually influence and precede the later Inca civilization, using stone-on-stone pounding techniques, wet sand and reed abrasives for smoothing, and copper tools supplemented by stone hammers, combined with an enormous, well-organized labor force operating over an extended construction period measured in centuries rather than years. Experimental archaeology projects have successfully replicated comparable levels of precision on smaller-scale test blocks using exactly these primitive methods, demonstrating that the techniques were, at minimum, physically possible using period-appropriate technology, even if the scale and consistency displayed across the entire Pumapunku block assemblage remains, even by the estimates of archaeologists who fully accept the conventional dating and method, an impressively demanding and time-consuming undertaking for the population and technology level in question. Ancient astronaut researchers and a smaller number of independent, non-ideologically aligned engineers who have examined the site point to several specific details they argue sit uneasily with the fully conventional account: the extreme hardness of the andesite stone itself, chosen, if the conventional narrative holds, from a much softer and more locally convenient sandstone alternative available at the same site and used for other, less precisely finished structures nearby, raising the question of why a culture already possessing an easier local material would deliberately select and transport a far harder stone from a quarry several miles distant specifically for its most demanding, most precisely finished architectural elements. The presence of certain surface marks that some engineers have suggested resemble patterns produced by mechanical rotary cutting rather than manual abrasion, a claim that remains genuinely disputed and unresolved rather than proven, since replicable, controlled comparative testing, distinguishing ancient tool marks from natural weathering and later damage, is notoriously difficult to conduct with full scientific rigor on an already damaged, already looted, and already partially reconstructed archaeological site, and perhaps most provocatively, a body of local and later Inca oral tradition that does not attribute the site's construction to ordinary human builders at all, but to Viracocha, a supreme creator deity credited in Andean tradition with civilizing an early primitive population, teaching them agriculture, law, and architecture before departing across the waters, or in some tradition variants, ascending into the sky and promising to return. This account, a civilizing sky god teaching agriculture and architecture to a primitive humanity before an eventual promised departure and return, will by this point in the series sound immediately, almost uncannily familiar to anything already covered regarding Enki in Mesopotamia and Osiris in Egypt. And the same structural template recurs, if anything even more explicitly, and with even greater specific historical consequence, in the Mesoamerican tradition of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity of the Aztec, and, under the closely related name Kukulkan of the Maya, credited across multiple independent Mesoamerican cultural traditions with teaching agriculture, calendar keeping, and law to an early human population, consistently described in the earliest surviving accounts as bearded and pale-skinned, an unusual and much debated physical description for a deity worshipped by populations who were themselves neither before departing eastward across the sea with an explicit promise of eventual return. That specific promise of return carries one of the most consequential and best documented historical footnotes in this entire series, because when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in 1519, in the exact year that, according to the Aztec calendar, corresponded to Quetzalcoatl's prophesied year of return, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma II is recorded by multiple independent Spanish and, notably, later Aztec-descended chroniclers, including the Florentine Codex compiled under the direction of the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, working directly with Aztec informants after the conquest, as having genuinely hesitated in his initial military response to the Spanish landing, reportedly influenced by uncertainty over whether Cortés and his men might represent the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl or his emissaries, a hesitation historians broadly agree contributed meaningfully, alongside superior Spanish weaponry, tactical alliance building with rival indigenous states resentful of Aztec dominance, and the catastrophic and unintentional introduction of European disease to the speed and completeness of the subsequent Aztec collapse. It is worth noting, in the interest of full accuracy, that the precise extent and sincerity of Moctezuma's Quetzalcoatl-related hesitation remains a genuinely debated question among historians of the conquest, with some scholars arguing later Spanish accounts may have exaggerated or even partially invented this framing after the fact to portray the conquest as divinely sanctioned or providentially assisted, rather than as a straightforward act of military conquest and opportunistic political alliance building. Whatever the precise historical truth of Moctezuma's specific state of mind, the underlying Quetzalcoatl prophecy itself and its wide, well-documented circulation throughout Aztec religious and calendrical tradition prior to any Spanish contact is not seriously disputed. The broader pattern this series has now traced across four entirely separate ancient civilizations: Sumerian Enki, Egyptian Osiris, Andean Viracocha, and Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, each a civilizing figure credited with bringing agriculture, law, and architectural knowledge to an early human population, each associated with water or sky-based arrival and eventual departure, and each carrying an explicit promise or expectation of eventual return, represents, this series argues, one of the most significant and most under-examined pieces of comparative evidence available to the entire ancient astronaut framework, precisely because it recurs not merely within a single interconnected cultural sphere where direct transmission and borrowing offers an easy conventional explanation, as it does across the various closely related Near Eastern traditions covered in earlier parts, but across civilizations separated by entire oceans with no credible, evidentially supported route of direct ancient contact between Mesoamerica and the Old World prior to the Norse and later Spanish arrivals. Mainstream anthropology's explanation for this specific cross-oceanic recurrence rests on a concept sometimes called cultural universalism, the observation that human societies facing broadly similar developmental challenges, the transition from small-scale hunting and gathering towards settled agriculture, and the accompanying need for calendrical, legal, and architectural knowledge to support that transition, tend to generate broadly similar explanatory myths independently. a civilizing culture hero figure being one of the most common and well-documented mythological archetypes identified across world folklore studies generally, appearing in contexts with no plausible connection to ancient astronauts whatsoever, and requiring no shared historical contact or shared real extraterrestrial event to explain its recurrence. This series presents that mainstream anthropological explanation as genuinely serious, genuinely well supported by the broader comparative folklore record, and again, not something the ancient astronaut framework can simply dismiss out of hand. What the ancient astronaut framework contributes to this specific debate is not a refutation of cultural universalism as a real and operating phenomenon, but a narrower, more pointed observation that the specific combination of details recurring across these four widely separated traditions, not merely a generic civilizing hero, but one specifically associated with sky or water-based arrival, specifically credited with advanced architectural and astronomical knowledge exceeding what the receiving culture otherwise independently possessed, and specifically carrying a promise of return tied to a fixed, calendrically calculated future date, represents a more specific and more unusual cluster of shared detail than the broader, more generic culture hero archetype alone would predict, even accounting for genuine, independent psychological universalism across unconnected human societies. This series does not claim to resolve, in either direction, which of these two explanatory frameworks, independent cultural universalism or scattered memory of a genuinely shared ancient historical event, better accounts for this recurring global pattern, and it asks that you weigh the evidence presented across this and the preceding several parts with exactly the same care and skepticism that has been applied throughout. What can be said with confidence, regardless of which explanation you ultimately favor, is that the pattern itself is real, extensively documented by mainstream anthropologists and historians in its own right, and considerably older, considerably more widespread, and considerably more specific in its recurring detail than casual dismissal of the broader ancient astronaut framework as a purely modern, purely fringe invention would suggest. With this global survey now complete, this series returns, in part 14, to the central Mesopotamian narrative where it began, picking the thread back up in the centuries following the events covered in part 10, as the direct, physically present relationship between the Anunnaki and the human civilizations they had founded begins its long, gradual, and, according to the tablets, deeply reluctant, final transition toward complete withdrawal, a withdrawal the tablets associate with specific, datable historical events, a final war among the remaining Anunnaki factions, and the quiet, permanent end of the era this entire series has been documenting from its opening paragraph onward. The lament for Ur and the long withdrawal. Sometime around 2000 BCE, the great city of Ur, Nanner's city, the city Abraham's family had departed generations earlier, suffered a catastrophic military destruction at the hands of Elamite invaders from the east, an event so traumatic to the surviving Sumerian literary tradition that it produced an entire genre of Mesopotamian literature scholars now refer to as the city lament, of which the most complete and most extensively studied surviving example is a text called The Lament for Ur, composed, most likely, within a generation or two of the destruction itself, and preserved on multiple copied tablets found across several later Mesopotamian sites, evidence that the text was widely known, widely copied, and considered a significant piece of literature for centuries after the events it describes. What makes the Lament for Ur extraordinarily significant for the purposes of this series is not merely its description of the city's physical destruction. Extensive and vivid as that description is, temples burned, populations slaughtered or driven into exile, canals and fields left to ruin, but its specific, repeated, and almost obsessive focus on a different kind of loss entirely, the departure of the gods themselves from the city, described not as an abstract consequence of the destruction, but as its direct and immediate precondition. The text describes Nanar's own wife, the goddess Ningal, pleading directly and repeatedly before the assembled Anunnaki council, weeping, prostrating herself, begging that be spared the fate the council had apparently already determined for it, and being refused, the council's decision described as final and, crucially, already made before the actual physical destruction takes place, framing the Elamite military assault that follows not as an independent human historical event that the gods merely failed to prevent, but as the direct executed consequence of a decision reached within the Anunnaki command structure itself, human armies once again, as in the Pyramid Wars covered in Part 8, serving as the physical instrument carrying out a judgment whose true origin lay entirely outside human political calculation. The text goes on to describe, in some of the most emotionally vivid language to survive from the entire Sumerian literary corpus, Nanar himself being compelled to physically abandon his own city and his own temple, weeping as he does so, a departure the text frames not as symbolic religious language describing a city's fall from favor in some abstract theological sense, but as a specific, personal, physically described act. A being who had ruled and resided in Ur for centuries, forced by a decision made above him to leave. This pattern, gods described departing specific cities in advance of, or immediately preceding, that city's historical military destruction, recurs across multiple additional Mesopotamian city laments beyond the lament for Ur itself, including similar texts composed for the cities of Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu at various points across the following centuries, and it establishes, across this body of literature taken as a whole, a consistent narrative logic worth stating plainly. Mesopotamian religious tradition itself did not generally attribute a city's military and political collapse primarily to purely earthly causes, superior enemy tactics, resource shortfall, or political miscalculation. The causes a modern historian would naturally reach for first, but rather to the prior, deliberate withdrawal of that city's patron deity, human military and political catastrophe serving, throughout this literature, as symptom rather than cause. Ancient astronaut researchers point to this consistent pattern as further evidence that the underlying Anunnaki presence was understood by the people actually living through these events as tangibly real and directly consequential to political and military outcomes, rather than as the purely retrospective, symbolic religious explanation a more skeptical reading would assume it to be. Mainstream historians of religion, for their part, note that virtually every ancient polytheistic tradition worldwide developed broadly similar theological frameworks explaining military defeat as divine abandonment, rather than as pure secular political failure, a nearly universal ancient explanatory pattern that requires no literal, physically present departing beings to account for it, since attributing catastrophe to the withdrawal of divine favor, rather than to human error, served an obvious and well-documented psychological and political function across virtually every ancient society that developed the idea independently. Whichever reading you find more persuasive, the practical historical pattern the tablets describe across the following several centuries is unambiguous and increasingly consistent, a gradual, uneven, but ultimately unmistakable decline in the frequency, directness, and physical specificity of described Anunnaki interaction with human affairs. The vivid, physically detailed encounters described in the earliest Sumerian material, and even, as covered in Part 10, in the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, direct meals shared, direct physical touch, direct spoken instruction delivered face to face, give way across the Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods to a religious and literary tradition increasingly focused on omens, dreams, astrological interpretation, and indirect priestly mediation, direct physical divine appearance becoming, by this later period, an event described only in the most ancient, most reverently preserved older texts, rather than something the tablet's own contemporary authors claim to have witnessed or expect to witness themselves. This shift is extensively documented and entirely uncontroversial as a matter of literary and religious history. What remains contested is its underlying cause. Mainstream historians of religion generally attribute this shift to the ordinary, well-documented evolutionary trajectory of virtually all ancient polytheistic religious traditions, gradually abstracting and formalizing their divine figures over centuries as urban, literate, bureaucratic society matures and as direct, personal, small community religious experience naturally gives way to larger-scale, more institutionally mediated religious practice. Ancient astronaut researchers propose instead that this pattern reflects something more literal, an actual, gradual physical withdrawal of the Anunnaki themselves from direct personal presence on Earth, a withdrawal the tablets describe as neither sudden nor fully explained in any single surviving text, but pieced together, fragment by fragment, across dozens of later tablets, hinting at its underlying causes. Several distinct and not necessarily mutually exclusive explanations for this withdrawal appear scattered across the later Mesopotamian textual record, and honesty requires presenting them as the genuinely fragmentary, sometimes contradictory picture they actually form, rather than as a single, tidy, fully resolved narrative. Some tablets, particularly those associated with the later Assyrian royal court, describe ongoing and increasingly severe environmental degradation across the Mesopotamian heartland itself, a genuine and independently well-documented historical process of soil salinization and declining agricultural yield across southern Iraq, stretching across the entire second and into the first millennium BCE, a decline some ancient astronaut researchers connect back to the lingering evil wind contamination discussed in Part 8, though this remains, as noted there, one of the framework's more speculative individual claims, sitting alongside a mainstream explanation, gradual over-irrigation and soil salinity, that stands entirely adequately on its own without requiring any external contributing cause. A separate group of later tablets describes continuing, unresolved internal Anunnaki political conflict, the succession dispute between Marduk's line and Enlil's remaining descendants, discussed in Part 9, apparently never fully settled, generating, according to a handful of very late and very fragmentary texts, occasional continued outbreaks of internal conflict extending well into the first millennium BCE. Conflict, some researchers argue, eventually made continued large-scale, publicly visible Anunnaki presence on Earth simply too costly, too destabilizing, or too dangerous for the wider Anunnaki authority structure back on Nibiru, whatever remained of it, to continue sanctioning. A third, and considerably more straightforward explanation, requiring the least speculative extension beyond what the tablets directly state, appears in several later administrative and mythological fragments describing simple resource exhaustion. After many thousands of years of continuous gold extraction from the mines first established in Part 1, the specific geological deposits accessible using the extraction technology and labor available to the mission may have been substantially depleted, reducing or eliminating the original economic justification for maintaining a large, continuously present Anunnaki workforce on Earth at all. A straightforwardly practical, almost mundane explanation, entirely consistent with how any real, extractive colonial operation throughout actual human history has behaved once its underlying resource base was exhausted. Gradual disengagement, reduced staffing, and eventual full withdrawal, leaving behind a colonized population to continue on its own, now self-sufficient, now self-governing, and now, crucially, left holding only fragmentary, increasingly mythologized memory of an operation and a relationship whose original, practical, resource-driven logic had by that point been almost entirely forgotten by the descendants of the population that had actually lived through it. By the time the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, ending the last independent Mesopotamian political entity directly descended from the civilization this entire series began with, the religious and literary tradition of direct, physically embodied divine presence had, by every surviving textual account, already faded into distant legend even for the Babylonians themselves, preserved and ritually recited during festivals like the annual reading of the Enuma Elish, but no longer treated, even by its own priesthood, as describing events within living or even recently remembered historical experience. What remained, and what this series turns to directly in Part 15, was not the Anunnaki themselves, but their monuments, their genetic and cultural legacy scattered across every subsequent civilization this series has examined, and a body of considerably more recent testimony, the modern era's own extensive record of unexplained aerial phenomena, government disclosure, and continued reported contact that some researchers argue represents not the end of this story at all, but its quiet, still ongoing continuation. From clay tablets to radar returns, for most of the 20th century, the study of ancient astronaut theory and the study of modern, unidentified flying object phenomena developed as largely separate fields, pursued by different researchers, publishing in different venues, drawing on entirely different bodies of evidence, one rooted in archaeology, linguistics, and comparative mythology, the other rooted in eyewitness testimony, radar data, and, increasingly in recent years, declassified government documentation. It was really only with the publication of Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods in 1968, and considerably more rigorously, if still highly controversially, with Sitchin's work beginning in 1976, that these two fields were explicitly and systematically linked into the single unified narrative this series has been presenting, that the beings described in ancient religious and mythological texts worldwide were the same category of physically real, technologically advanced, non-human beings that a growing number of 20th and 21st century witnesses, including, as this series will detail, credentialed military and government personnel, have reported observing directly in modern aircraft, modern radar returns, and modern gun camera footage. The modern era of this discussion is generally dated to June 1947, when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported observing 9 crescent-shaped objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier in Washington state, at what he estimated to be extraordinary speed, a sighting that received widespread press coverage, and that, through a reporter's imprecise paraphrase of Arnold's own description of the object's motion rather than their shape, gave rise to the popular term flying saucer. Weeks later, in early July 1947, wreckage recovered from a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico, prompted the local Roswell Army Airfield to issue a press release stating that personnel had recovered a flying disc. A release swiftly retracted and replaced within 24 hours by an official explanation identifying the debris as a conventional weather balloon. This rapid reversal, combined with decades of subsequent witness testimony from individuals present at the recovery site describing material and circumstances they maintain were inconsistent with an ordinary weather balloon, transformed the Roswell incident into the single most extensively investigated and most culturally significant UFO case in American history. The United States Air Force, in a lengthy 1994 and 1997 series of official reports, ultimately acknowledged that the original 1947 weather balloon explanation had been incomplete, revising the official account to identify the recovered debris as wreckage from a classified high-altitude surveillance balloon program called Project Mogul, designed to monitor Soviet nuclear testing, while separately attributing later witness reports of recovered bodies to misremembered or conflated later Air Force anthropomorphic test dummy drops conducted in the same general region during the 1950s. This official revised explanation remains disputed by a significant community of independent researchers, and by several of the original witnesses and their families, who maintain the classified balloon and later decade dummy drop explanations fail to adequately account for the specific physical materials and circumstances described in the earliest, most contemporaneous witness accounts from 1947 itself. The following decades produced an enormous and steadily accumulating body of additional reported sightings, official government investigation, and periodic partial disclosure, far too extensive to summarize completely within this series, but several developments carry particular weight for the specific argument this series has been building and deserve direct, careful treatment. The United States Air Force conducted an official, publicly acknowledged UFO investigation program from 1947 through 1969, passing through several successive names before settling on Project Blue Book, which examined over 12,000 individual reported sightings before its closure, ultimately attributing the substantial majority to conventional explanations, aircraft, weather phenomena, astronomical objects, and hoaxes, while formally acknowledging, in its own final report, that a residual percentage, generally cited as around 6% of cases, several hundred individual sightings, remained genuinely unexplained, even after full investigation, a category the Air Force's own concluding analysis stated showed no evidence of extraterrestrial origin, a conclusion critics of the program have long argued reflected an institutional and public relations imperative to close the file on an increasingly politically inconvenient topic rather than a fully rigorous, exhaustive scientific resolution of every individual unexplained case. Far more significant for the current state of this discussion is the substantial shift in official government posture that has occurred over the past several years, a shift this series can discuss with considerably greater factual confidence than the more historically distant Roswell material, because it is recent, extensively documented in official government publications, and has occurred largely within public view. Beginning with a 2017 New York Times report revealing the existence of a previously secret Pentagon program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that had for years been investigating and cataloging military encounters with what the government now formally terms Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, or UAP, deliberately replacing the older and more culturally loaded term UFO. The United States government has, across several subsequent years, released a series of official reports directly to Congress, including a widely covered June 2021 preliminary assessment and subsequent annual reports from the newly established All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, publicly acknowledging that United States military personnel have recorded numerous credible instances of aircraft, tracked simultaneously by multiple independent sensor systems, radar, infrared, and direct visual observation from trained naval and Air Force pilots, exhibiting flight characteristics. These official reports themselves describe as exceeding the known technological and physical performance capability of any publicly acknowledged aircraft, whether foreign or domestic, including instantaneous acceleration, sustained hypersonic velocity without visible propulsion signature, and observed transitions between air and water with no apparent loss of structural integrity or deceleration. It is essential to state plainly and precisely what these official government reports do and do not claim, because public discussion of this topic has frequently overstated the government's own actual published position in both directions. The official reports do not claim, and explicitly and repeatedly decline to claim, that any of these observed phenomena have been confirmed to be of extraterrestrial origin. The reports instead explicitly list several possible categories of explanation under active continued investigation, including foreign adversary drone or surveillance technology exceeding what has been publicly disclosed, sensor and observational error or misidentification, and a residual, formally acknowledged category of cases that remain, after rigorous multi-agency review, genuinely unexplained using any currently identified conventional, foreign, or domestic technological explanation. This formally acknowledged residual category of genuinely unexplained cases, however, and its associated officially documented flight performance characteristics, represents, this series argues, a genuinely significant and often underappreciated data point in this broader discussion, entirely independent of any claim about ancient civilizations. It establishes on the record, through official United States government publication rather than through any private researchers' claim, that credentialed military observers using rigorous, multiply-redundant sensor systems have documented aerial phenomena whose performance characteristics remain, as of this recording, without a confirmed conventional explanation. This series takes no position on whether these officially documented modern phenomena are connected in any way to the ancient historical narrative covered across the preceding 14 parts, and it must be stated directly that no credible evidentiary link between the two bodies of evidence, ancient text and modern radar data, has been established by any rigorous, peer-reviewed research to date. The connection remains, at this point, an inference drawn by ancient astronaut proponents based on the broad thematic similarity of both phenomena describing advanced, non-conventional aerial technology rather than on any specific, direct evidentiary bridge between the two. What can be said with considerably more confidence is that the underlying premise ancient astronaut theory rests on, that non-human intelligences possessing flight technology beyond current conventional human capability may exist and may have interacted or may continue to interact with human affairs, is no longer, as of the past several years, a premise confined purely to fringe speculation or ancient historical reinterpretation, but is now a premise the United States government's own officially published reports treat as, at minimum, a genuinely open and formally unresolved question, a significant shift in the respectability and public seriousness of this broader category of inquiry that this series would be remiss not to note directly. Sitchin himself, for his part, offered a considerably more specific and more directly falsifiable claim connecting these two threads, one this series must address plainly given its significant influence on decades of subsequent popular ancient astronaut discussion, that Nibiru's long, roughly 3,600-year elliptical orbit would bring it back into observable proximity to Earth within a time frame calculable from the tablet's own astronomical references, a specific predicted return date Sitchin and various subsequent popularizers estimated at different points and with differing methodologies, variously for the early 21st century. No astronomical observation, by NASA, by any professional observatory, or by any amateur astronomer anywhere in the world, has ever detected any planetary body consistent with Nibiru's described characteristics, mass, or orbital path, despite this specific predicted return window having now passed by a comfortable margin according to most of the popularized estimates. This absence of any corroborating astronomical observation stands as the single most direct, most testable, and most decisively unfavorable piece of evidence against Sitchin's specific interpretive framework, and this series presents it plainly, without qualification, as a genuine and unresolved failure of the theory's most concrete and most falsifiable individual prediction, one that Sitchin's most committed remaining defenders have generally addressed only by revising the predicted timeline further into the future or by questioning the completeness of modern astronomical survey coverage in the outer solar system, neither of which constitutes a satisfying resolution to a prediction that was, in its original form, presented with considerably more specificity and confidence than the available evidence has gone on to support. Having now presented both the strongest supporting evidence and the most significant unresolved weaknesses in the ancient astronaut framework as it has developed across nearly half a century of research and popular discussion, this series turns, in its remaining parts, to drawing together the full body of evidence presented across this entire narrative, beginning in Part 16 with a direct, comprehensive examination of the strongest scientific and archaeological counter-arguments mainstream scholarship has raised against nearly every major claim this series has covered, presented with the same rigor and fairness this series has attempted to apply throughout, before turning, in its final parts, to the genuinely open questions this evidence leaves unresolved, and to what a careful, skeptical, but genuinely open-minded reader is left to conclude once all of it has been laid honestly on the table. The case against what the critics get right. No honest documentary treatment of ancient astronaut theory can proceed without a direct, sustained, and unflinching examination of the scholarly criticism the field has received. And this criticism deserves to be presented with the same care this series has applied to the theory's supporting evidence, not as a brief, dismissive coda, but as a substantial body of argument that any fair-minded viewer needs to weigh seriously. The single most sustained and most technically detailed critique of Sitchin's specific work comes from professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists, scholars who have spent entire careers learning to read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform directly, and their core objection is not primarily philosophical or ideological, but narrowly linguistic and technical. They argue that Sitchin's translations of specific key terms, the words rendered as rocket, as spacesuit, as the planet Nibiru itself, do not hold up against the accumulated, cross-referenced, dictionary-verified body of Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary established over more than a century of continuous, collaborative scholarly work involving thousands of independently excavated and cross-checked tablets. The word Sitchin translates as Nibiru's identifying astronomical term. For instance, professional Assyriologists, including Michael Heiser, a scholar who has written extensively and specifically challenging Sitchin's work from within a rigorous linguistic framework, argue is used inconsistently across different tablets to refer to several different astronomical bodies and concepts, depending entirely on context, including, in different specific texts, the planet Jupiter, the planet Mercury, and even the star Sirius, undermining the claim that a single, fixed, undiscovered planet is being consistently referenced across the corpus. Similarly, the specific Sumerian and Akkadian terms Sitchin renders as describing rocket ships and spacesuits are documented in the broader dictionary and lexical tradition built up across the field's entire history of collaborative translation work as referring more plausibly and more consistently when checked against their full range of attested uses across many different tablets rather than cherry-picked from the single passages most favorable to an ancient astronaut reading to conventional ancient technology and religious symbolism, chariots, ceremonial garments, and standard divine iconography consistent with and directly comparable to similar imagery found across the wider polytheistic religious traditions of the ancient Near East generally, imagery that does not require, and in the professional consensus view does not support, a literal spacecraft or spacesuit interpretation. This series must state plainly that this linguistic critique carries real, substantial weight and represents the single strongest and most difficult to dismiss objection to the ancient astronaut framework as popularized specifically through Sitchin's work. Sitchin was not, whatever his considerable talent for narrative synthesis and his genuine years of independent study, a credentialed, institutionally trained Assyriologist working within the field's established peer review and cross-verification process, and his specific translations have not been validated, replicated, or accepted by the broader professional community of scholars who continue to actively work with these same primary texts today. Where this series has drawn on Sitchin's specific interpretive claims throughout the preceding 15 parts, it has attempted, wherever possible, to flag those claims explicitly as contested and to present the mainstream philological alternative alongside them, and it repeats that framing here directly and without qualification the specific linguistic case for Nibiru, for literal spacecraft, and for literal genetic engineering encoded directly and unambiguously in the primary Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary itself, remains unaccepted by the overwhelming majority of scholars professionally qualified to evaluate it, and this is not a minor or peripheral objection, but one that goes to the very foundation of the theory's specific evidentiary claims. The genetic and evolutionary claims covered extensively in Part 2 deserve equally direct treatment. Mainstream evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology possess a well-developed, extensively fossil-supported, and increasingly genetically corroborated account of human origins that does not require and finds no supporting evidence for any external genetic intervention at any point in the hominid lineage. The fossil record documents a gradual, multi-million-year sequence of transitional hominid species, from early Australopithecines through multiple Homo species, including Erectus, Heidelbergensis, and Neanderthalensis, culminating in anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerging in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago, a sequence extensively corroborated by an enormous, continuously growing body of fossil discovery across multiple independent excavation sites, and increasingly cross-validated by ancient DNA sequencing work that has directly recovered and analyzed genetic material from Neanderthal, Denisovan, and early modern human remains, establishing clear, traceable genetic relationships and interbreeding events entirely within known terrestrial hominid populations, with no genetic signature identified in any sequenced ancient or modern human genome that would indicate the kind of large-scale, deliberate cross-species genetic splicing event the ancient astronaut framework proposes. The Great Leap Forward, behavioral discontinuity, discussed in Part 2, while genuinely debated in its precise causes and timeline, is increasingly explained by mainstream researchers not as evidence of a sudden discontinuous intervention, but as a reflection of gradually accumulating cultural and cognitive complexity combined with a patchier and more geographically scattered archaeological record for the preceding periods than was previously appreciated, an explanation that has gained considerable ground as earlier evidence of symbolic behavior, deliberate ochre pigment use, shell bead ornamentation, and engraved abstract patterns has been discovered at older and older African sites in recent decades, gradually smoothing what once appeared to be an abrupt discontinuity into a more continuous, if still imperfectly understood, developmental trajectory. The archaeological dating challenges raised throughout this series, particularly regarding the Great Pyramid's construction date discussed in Part 11, similarly deserve to be restated here in their strongest form. Multiple independent dating methodologies, radiocarbon analysis of embedded organic material, quarry marks bearing contemporaneous royal names in sealed, inaccessible internal chambers, and directly corroborating administrative papyri documenting the actual historical workforce and logistics involved, converge on a consistent 4th Dynasty construction date, and no comparably rigorous, independently replicated body of evidence exists supporting any earlier construction date for the structure. Extraordinary claims, as the often cited principle in scientific reasoning holds, require extraordinarily strong evidence, and the specific claim of pre-dynastic or non-human pyramid construction has not met that evidentiary bar in the professional archaeological literature. However genuinely impressive the structure's engineering achievements remain on their own conventional terms. It is also worth directly addressing a broader methodological criticism that applies across nearly the entire ancient astronaut framework as a category of inquiry, one articulated most forcefully by historians of science and by skeptical researchers such as the physicist and science communicator Carl Sagan, who, notably, took the underlying question of ancient extraterrestrial contact seriously enough to co-author, alongside Soviet astrophysicist Iosif Shklovsky, a lengthy, genuinely rigorous scientific examination of the possibility in their 1966 book, Intelligent Life in the Universe, ultimately concluding that while the possibility could not be entirely dismissed on purely theoretical grounds, the specific popularized evidentiary claims advanced by von Daniken and later Sitchin failed, on individual careful examination, to hold up as compelling evidence, each specific claimed anomaly generally admitting a more mundane, better evidenced conventional explanation once subjected to rigorous scrutiny by specialists actually qualified in the relevant field, whether that field was Egyptology, comparative linguistics, or orbital mechanics. Sagan's broader methodological point, echoed since by numerous subsequent skeptical researchers, is that the ancient astronaut framework's persuasive power tends to derive less from the individual strength of any single piece of evidence, each of which, examined closely and specifically by relevant experts, tends to admit a more conventional explanation, and more from the cumulative pattern-matching effect of stacking many individually weak or contested anomalies together into a single unified narrative, a rhetorical and cognitive effect that can feel compelling to a general audience even when no individual claim within the pattern would survive rigorous specialist examination on its own. This series has attempted, throughout its preceding 15 parts, to resist exactly this pattern stacking effect by examining each major claim on its own individual evidentiary merits, presenting the specific mainstream counter-explanation directly alongside each ancient astronaut interpretation, and it must state, at this point in the series, its own honest assessment of where that individual, claim-by-claim examination has actually left the overall picture. The theory's linguistic foundations, particularly Sitchin's specific cuneiform translations, remain genuinely and substantially unsupported by professional consensus. Its genetic and evolutionary claims run directly against an increasingly robust and well-corroborated body of independent fossil and genomic evidence. Its most specific, falsifiable prediction, Nibiru's calculated return, has not been observationally confirmed within its own predicted timeframe, and several of its most visually striking individual claims, including the Great Pyramid's construction date, rest on source material considerably less rigorous and less reliable than the mainstream archaeological dating evidence arrayed against them. What remains genuinely open, genuinely underexplained by mainstream scholarship's own more cautious and conservative standards, and genuinely worth continued serious inquiry, rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive ridicule, is the subject this series turns to directly in its next and final parts. Not whether Sitchin's specific, detailed reconstruction is correct in every particular, which the evidence increasingly suggests it is not, but whether the broader, more modest, and more defensible underlying observations this series has documented across its full length, the genuinely unusual speed of Sumerian civilizational emergence, the genuinely striking and extensively cross-culturally recurring mythological pattern of civilizing sky deities, the genuinely unresolved engineering questions surrounding several specific megalithic sites, and the genuinely significant and only very recently acknowledged official government position on unexplained modern aerial phenomena, together constitute a body of evidence that deserves to be taken more seriously and examined with more open, rigorous scientific curiosity than it has generally received from a mainstream academic establishment that has, at times, been arguably too quick to dismiss the entire category of inquiry alongside its weakest and most poorly evidenced specific claims. That final, careful weighing of the evidence and the genuinely open questions this series leaves for you, the viewer, to continue investigating on your own, is where this series turns next. What still doesn't add up? Having laid out, in Part 16, the strongest and most substantive case against the ancient astronaut framework's specific claims, intellectual honesty requires this series to now do the reverse, to lay out, with equal specificity and equal care to avoid overstatement, the handful of genuine anomalies that remain even after the mainstream critique has been fully and fairly absorbed, without a fully satisfying conventional explanation, because a fair accounting of this subject requires acknowledging that mostly explained is not the same as entirely explained, and several specific pieces of evidence continue to generate genuine, ongoing debate even among researchers with no particular attachment to the ancient astronaut framework at all. Baalbek in modern Lebanon deserves direct and specific treatment here because it did not receive the extended examination in Part 11 that this series promised back in Part 6. And its physical evidence is, by any measure, genuinely extraordinary. The site's Roman-era temple complex, built atop a much older podium of uncertain original date, rests on a foundation incorporating several of the largest single-dressed stone blocks ever used in any construction project in human history, most famously 3 blocks known collectively as the Trilithon, each measuring approximately 64 feet in length and weighing, by consistent modern engineering estimate, roughly 800 tons apiece, lifted and precisely fitted into a wall course several meters above ground level. A 4th block, left unfinished in the adjacent quarry and never moved into position, the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs an estimated 1,000 metric tons, and an even larger block, discovered still partially buried in the same quarry as recently as 2014, has been estimated by the German Archaeological Institute team that excavated it at approximately 1,650 tons, making it, by a considerable margin, the largest dressed stone block known to exist anywhere in the ancient world. Mainstream archaeology, it must be stated clearly, does not consider Baalbek's construction technologically inexplicable and has proposed reasonably plausible ancient engineering methods involving large-scale timber sledges, packed earthen ramps, extensive lever systems, and very large coordinated labor forces capable of moving blocks of this scale using technology and organizational capacity that Roman and pre-Roman Phoenician engineering by the 1st century BCE and earlier are independently documented to have possessed for other large-scale construction projects across the wider region. What remains genuinely debated, and this is a debate conducted largely among mainstream classical archaeologists themselves, rather than primarily by ancient astronaut proponents, is the precise original date and identity of the massive podium platform beneath the later, definitively Roman-built temple structures, since the platform's foundation displays construction techniques, cyclopean, tightly interlocking polygonal masonry using no binding mortar that differ noticeably from the smaller, more regular Roman ashlar masonry of the temples built directly atop it, raising a genuinely open, not fully resolved question regarding whether the platform represents an earlier, pre-Roman, possibly Phoenician-era religious structure repurposed and built upon by later Roman builders. A fairly conventional archaeological possibility with reasonable precedent elsewhere in the ancient world, or something considerably older still, as ancient astronaut researchers have proposed, without, it should be said, any independently dated archaeological evidence currently available to confirm that more extreme claim. A second genuinely open question concerns the specific astronomical knowledge embedded in Sumerian and Babylonian tradition, an area where this series must be considerably more careful and precise than popular ancient astronaut literature has often been. Sitchin's claim, frequently repeated across popular ancient astronaut media, that the Sumerians possess direct knowledge of the outer planets Uranus and Neptune, discovered by conventional telescopic astronomy only in 1781 and 1846 respectively, rests primarily on his own contested reading of a specific late Babylonian astronomical mythological text, sometimes called the Enuma Anu Enlil. A reading that has not been independently corroborated or accepted by professional historians of ancient astronomy who continue to identify no clear, unambiguous textual reference to any planet beyond Saturn in the authenticated body of Babylonian astronomical literature. What is considerably better established and does not require any ancient astronaut framework to remain genuinely impressive on its own terms is the documented sophistication of the surviving body of authentic Babylonian astronomical observation, including precisely recorded multi-century continuous observational records of Venus's movements preserved in the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, dating to the 17th century BCE, and a documented, mathematically sophisticated predictive capability for lunar and solar eclipses developed by later Neo-Babylonian and Persian-era Babylonian astronomers using purely arithmetic, non-telescopic methods, a genuine and well-documented achievement of ancient observational science that stands as remarkable in its own right without requiring any extraterrestrial assistance to explain it, and that this series presents accordingly on its own conventional and entirely well-supported merits. A third area worth revisiting directly is the human genome discussion introduced in Part 2, because genetic science has advanced considerably since Sitchin's original, more speculative claims about junk DNA representing artificially suppressed genetic material, and an honest updated treatment requires acknowledging that advanced directly rather than repeating outdated framing. The scientific consensus regarding non-coding DNA has shifted substantially over the past 2 decades, moving away from the earlier dismissive junk terminology as research. Particularly the large-scale ENCODE project completed in 2012 has demonstrated that a very substantial proportion of this non-coding genetic material performs genuine, identifiable regulatory functions, controlling when, where, and how strongly nearby protein-coding genes are expressed, functioning less like inert genetic debris and more like an elaborate, still incompletely mapped control and switching system layered around the smaller portion of the genome that directly codes for proteins. This mainstream scientific finding, that non-coding DNA is functionally significant rather than inert, is sometimes invoked by ancient astronaut proponents as supporting evidence for the idea of deliberate genetic engineering. But this series must state directly that this represents a considerable overreach. The existence of genuine regulatory function in non-coding DNA is now well-established mainstream science, but nothing in this established regulatory function provides any specific evidence of deliberate external genetic tampering by an outside intelligence, as opposed to the same non-coding regulatory architecture having arisen through entirely conventional evolutionary processes, including gene duplication, retroviral genetic insertion events accumulated across millions of years, and ordinary natural selection acting on regulatory sequences precisely as it acts on protein coding sequences, a mainstream evolutionary explanation for regulatory genome complexity that carries no requirement for external intervention of any kind, and that the overwhelming majority of working geneticists consider entirely sufficient to account for the observed complexity. What this honest, updated survey leaves this series with, at this point in its narrative, is neither a triumphant vindication of the ancient astronaut framework nor a complete demolition of it, but something considerably more modest and, this series would argue, considerably more intellectually defensible. A small number of genuinely specific, genuinely unresolved physical and archaeological puzzles, the precise original dating and purpose of the Baalbek podium chief among them, sitting alongside a much larger body of claims, the specific cuneiform translations, the specific genetic engineering mechanism, the specific Nibiru orbital prediction that have not survived closer examination by relevant specialists, and that this series has attempted to flag honestly and specifically throughout, rather than allowing to pass unchallenged. A careful viewer is entitled to hold both of these conclusions simultaneously, taking the genuine anomalies seriously as worthy of continued research, while declining to extend that same seriousness automatically to every individual claim advanced under the same broad ancient astronaut umbrella, however emotionally satisfying it might be to treat the entire framework as either wholly validated or wholly dismissed. It is with this carefully qualified, evidence-weighed position that this series turns, in its final parts, back to the human story. This entire narrative was ultimately always about, not the unresolved archaeological puzzles or the contested linguistic debates in isolation, but the deeper, stranger, and in many ways, more important question underlying the entire inquiry from its very first paragraph. What does it mean for a species to have inherited an origin story, told and retold across every major civilization that has ever existed, in which we are not the product of pure chance and undirected natural process alone, but the deliberate, purposeful product of another intelligence's decision, made for reasons that had far more to do with that intelligence's own needs than with any inherent destiny or purpose of our own? And what, if anything, that inherited story should mean to us today, 4,000 years and a great many empires later, still asking many of the same questions the very first Sumerian scribes were already asking when they pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and wrote down, for the first time in recorded history, the words, "When kingship was lowered from heaven." Why this story never died. Every civilization this series has examined, Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Egyptian, Andean, and Mesoamerican, arrived independently or through documented cultural transmission at some version of the same basic origin claim that humanity did not simply happen but was made deliberately by beings who were themselves physically real, who had their own needs, their own conflicts, and their own reasons, often self-interested reasons, for bringing us into existence. This is worth pausing on directly because it represents a genuinely distinct psychological and theological position from the one most modern people, whether religious or secular, typically hold about human origins today. The modern secular scientific account describes humanity as the product of an unguided, purposeless evolutionary process, extraordinary in its outcome, but indifferent in its mechanism. Modern mainstream monotheistic religious traditions, by contrast, generally describe humanity as the deliberate, loving creation of a single, benevolent, omnipotent God, made in that God's image for reasons rooted in divine love and purpose. The ancient account this series has spent 17 parts examining occupies a genuinely distinct third position, one modern religious and secular frameworks alike have largely moved away from: humanity as the deliberate creation of beings who were neither purely indifferent natural forces nor purely benevolent all-loving creators, but something closer to a competent, self-interested engineering team solving an immediate practical labor problem, who nonetheless, according to the same body of tablets, developed genuine attachment, genuine internal disagreement, and, in Enki's case specifically, something approaching real paternal affection for the species they had built. This particular framing, a creation motivated by need rather than pure love, staffed by flawed, quarreling, recognizably fallible personalities rather than a single perfect and unified divine will, may help explain something that has genuinely puzzled comparative religious scholars for generations. Why this specific category of origin narrative, the deliberately engineered, imperfectly motivated creation story, achieved such remarkably wide and remarkably persistent distribution across the ancient world, surviving in fragmentary and transformed shape, even within religious traditions like Judaism and Christianity that ultimately moved decisively toward a very different, singular, purely benevolent theological model. One plausible explanation, requiring no extraterrestrial framework at all to hold together on its own terms, is that this story format simply reflects a recognizable and enduringly resonant psychological truth about the human condition itself, the felt experience, common across an enormous range of human individual and collective life, of having been brought into a world we did not choose, shaped by forces and expectations we did not consent to, expected to labor and produce, and serve purposes that were established long before we arrived, and that only partially, if at all, align with our own independent sense of what we might want for ourselves. A creation story featuring flawed, self-interested creators, arguing among themselves over how much freedom, knowledge, and lifespan their creation should be permitted, may simply resonate more deeply and more durably with lived human experience across every subsequent generation than a story of purely idealized, uncomplicated divine benevolence ever fully could, regardless of whether either story reflects anything approaching literal historical or scientific fact. This series has, throughout its length, tried to hold two things in mind simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. The specific factual, evidentiary question of whether the Anunnaki were real, physically present, technologically advanced non-human beings who genuinely visited and shaped early human civilization, a question this series has examined claim by claim and left, honestly, only partially resolved, with genuine unresolved anomalies sitting alongside a larger body of claims that has not survived close specialist scrutiny, and the separate, broader cultural and psychological question of why this particular story, regardless of its literal truth, has proven so durable, so widely distributed, and so capable of being rediscovered, reinterpreted, and retold by each successive generation, from Sumerian scribes pressing cuneiform into wet clay, to Hebrew editors compiling Genesis during the Babylonian captivity, to Zechariah Sitchin decoding tablets in the 20th century, to a modern documentary audience encountering this same underlying material once again today, thousands of years after the last person who might have witnessed any of it firsthand. It is worth noting, in closing this particular line of reflection, that the two questions are not entirely as separable as a strict evidentiary framework might wish them to be, because the persistent cultural power of a story is not in itself evidence either for or against its literal historical accuracy, a point too often lost in popular treatments of this material that lean too heavily on the story's emotional resonance and its cross-cultural ubiquity, as though these facts alone constitute proof of an underlying real historical event. A story can be culturally powerful, psychologically resonant, and repeatedly rediscovered across independent civilizations, precisely as this series has documented across its full survey of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and American traditions, entirely because it speaks to something true and recognizable about universal human experience and human social organization, without that story also being a literal historical record of physically real events involving physically real extraterrestrial visitors. Both of these things, a story's psychological truth and a story's literal historical truth, can exist independently of one another, and a genuinely careful, evidence-respecting examination of this material, of the kind this series has attempted to provide across its full length, has to be willing to hold that distinction clearly in view rather than collapsing the two together, simply because doing so produces a more emotionally satisfying, more narratively complete conclusion. What this series can say, with confidence, having now examined this material across 17 parts and thousands of years of recorded human religious, mythological, and archaeological history, is this: Something happened in southern Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago that remains, even under the most conservative, most skeptical, most fully mainstream archaeological interpretation available, genuinely unusual, a civilization emerging with a speed and completeness that continues to generate serious scholarly discussion regarding its precise causes. Something in the specific, recurring structure of ancient religious narrative, not merely the vague, generic presence of gods and creation myths, which every culture naturally produces, but the specific, repeated appearance of a rebellious, sympathetic, knowledge-sharing creator figure locked in conflict with a more rigid, authoritarian counterpart, recurs across separated ancient civilizations with a consistency that continues to generate genuine, unresolved debate between cultural universalism and shared historical memory as competing explanations. And something in the modern era, entirely independent of any ancient claim, has now been officially acknowledged in formal government reporting rather than in speculative popular literature regarding aerial phenomena that remain, even after rigorous military and intelligence community review, without a confirmed conventional explanation. None of these three observations, taken individually, proves that the Anunnaki were real, that they engineered human beings for a labor force in a Mesopotamian gold mine, or that they continue, in some form, to watch over or occasionally visit the species they may or may not have created. But taken together and examined with the same rigor this series has attempted to apply throughout, they constitute a genuinely legitimate, genuinely still open field of inquiry, one that deserves considerably more careful, considerably more rigorous, and considerably less reflexively dismissive engagement from mainstream academic institutions than it has generally received over the past half-century, precisely because the alternative, treating every one of these observations as fully and finally resolved by convention alone, requires a degree of confidence that the evidence itself, examined honestly and specifically rather than dismissed wholesale, simply does not yet support in either direction. This series concludes, in its final parts, by returning to where it began, to the tablets themselves, still sitting by the tens of thousands, untranslated, in museum storage rooms around the world, waiting for a new generation of scholars, and to the question this entire documentary was ultimately built to leave with you, the viewer, unresolved, and, this series would argue, rightly so, because some questions are more valuable held open in continued honest inquiry than closed prematurely simply for the comfort of having an answer. The tablets still unread. We began this series in the summer of 1849 with a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard standing over a buried library at Nineveh, uncovering 30,000 tablets pressed with a script no living person could read. It is worth returning to that image now, at the close of this journey, because it captures something that has remained true across every single part of this series since. The vast majority of the evidence this story rests on is not lost. It is not hidden in some inaccessible location, guarded or suppressed by any conspiracy. It is sitting, right now, in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in the Pergamon, in the Iraq Museum, and in dozens of university archives around the world, in climate-controlled storage, cataloged, photographed in many cases, and simply waiting for the small number of qualified specialists the field of Assyriology has ever produced to find the time, across careers already stretched thin, translating the tablets already known to be significant, to read what the rest of it says. That fact alone should temper both the most enthusiastic and the most dismissive reactions to everything this series has covered. It should temper enthusiasm because it means the confident, fully resolved narrative popular ancient astronaut literature sometimes presents, of secrets fully decoded and mysteries fully solved, outruns what the actual, still incomplete body of translated evidence can currently support. And this series has tried, across 18 prior parts, to flag every point at which a specific claim rests on contested translation, incomplete evidence, or an interpretive leap beyond what the primary sources themselves can bear. But it should also temper dismissiveness, because a field with this much primary source material still unexamined is not, by definition, a field where every question has already been definitively closed in the opposite direction either. The honest position, the position this series has tried to model rather than simply state, is one of genuine, sustained curiosity, willing to sit with real uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely in either direction, simply because uncertainty is uncomfortable. What we can say, having traced this story from the first Sumerian creation tablets through the Garden of Eden, the flood, the wars of the gods, the pyramids of Giza, the stones of the Andes, and into the officially acknowledged unexplained aerial phenomena of the present day, is that human beings have never, at any point in their recorded history, told themselves a simple story about where they came from. Every single civilization this series examined, independently or through documented cultural inheritance, arrived at some version of the same complicated, uncomfortable, and strangely durable claim that we were made on purpose by beings who were not simple, not uniformly benevolent, and not disinterested. Beings who argued over us, who took risks for us, who occasionally protected us against their own superiors' wishes, and who, according to nearly every single one of these traditions, eventually left. That departure, examined across Part 14's account of the lament for echoes forward into something worth stating plainly as we close. Every single one of these ancient traditions describes not permanent absence, but an unresolved ending, a withdrawal without a clearly stated reason, and, in several of the traditions this series examined most closely, an explicit promise, or at minimum, an expectation of eventual return. Whether that promise reflects a genuine ancient historical expectation rooted in some real, still unexplained relationship, or reflects instead a deeply human, deeply universal psychological need to believe that an absence this significant cannot simply be permanent and unexplained, that there must be a reason, a plan, and an eventual reunion waiting somewhere beyond the horizon of recorded history, is a question this series leaves deliberately and honestly in your hands rather than resolving it for you. What this series has tried to offer across its full length is not a verdict, but a case, laid out claim by claim, tablet by tablet, with the strongest available evidence and the strongest available counter-evidence presented side by side wherever the material allowed for it. The Sumerians left us the oldest written stories in human history, and those stories describe, in specific, repeated, and often startlingly technical detail, an origin far stranger than the one most of us were taught to expect, whether in a school classroom or in a house of worship. Modern scholarship has shown convincingly that many of the specific claims built on top of those tablets by 20th century popularizers do not survive close linguistic and scientific scrutiny. And modern scholarship has, at the very same time, been unable to fully close the door on several of the deeper anomalies this same body of evidence continues to raise: the speed of civilization's emergence, the specificity of a recurring mythological pattern spanning oceans and unconnected cultures, and the simple, undeniable, officially documented fact that the sky above us, even today, continues to contain things we cannot yet explain. Perhaps the most honest way to close this story is the way it has, in one form or another, always closed, across every single culture this series has surveyed. Not with an answer, but with a question, carved into clay 4,000 years before any of us were born, and never fully resolved by any civilization that has read it since. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the Sumerians wrote, kingship was in Eridu. They did not explain, in any tablet we have yet recovered, and perhaps in any tablet we ever will recover, exactly what came down, or exactly why, or exactly where it went when it finally left. They simply wrote down that it happened as plainly and as matter-of-factly as they recorded the price of barley or the height of the river that season, and they trusted that whoever came after them, reading those words on a fragment of baked clay thousands of years later, would take the claim seriously enough to keep asking. This series has tried to do exactly that. The rest, as it has been from the very beginning of this story, is left to you. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.